Forward. India is a world unto itself, apart in manners, customs, occultism from the world and life with which we are familiar. Even upon far Barsum or Amta might be found no more baffling mysteries than those which lie hidden in the secret places of the brains and lives of her people. We sometimes feel that what we do not understand must be bad, that is our heritage from the ignorance and superstition of the painted savages from which we are descended. Of the many good things that have come to us out of India, I am concerned at present with but one, the power which old Chand Kabi transmitted to the son of an English officer and his American wife to transmit his thoughts and visualizations to the mind of another at distances even as great as those which separate the planets. It is to this power we owe the fact that Carson Napier has been able to record, through me, the story of his adventures upon the planet Venus. When he took off from Guadalupe Island in his giant rocket ship for Mars, I listened to the story of that epochal flight that ended, through an error in calculation, upon Venus. I followed his adventures there that started in the island kingdom of Vapaja, where he fell desperately in love with Duer, the unattainable daughter of the king. I followed their wanderings across seas and land masses into the hostile city of Kapta, and Korma, the city of the dead, to glorious Havatu, where Duer was condemned to death through a strange miscarriage of justice. I thrilled with excitement during their perilous escape in the aeroplane that Carson Napier had built at the request of the rulers of Havatu. And always I suffered with Napier because of Duer's unalterable determination to look upon his love as an insult to the virgin daughter of the king of Vapaja. She repulsed him constantly because she was a princess, but in the end I rejoiced with him when she realized the truth and acknowledged that though she could not forget that she was a princess, she had discovered that she was a woman first. That was immediately after they had escaped from Havatu and were winging their way above the river of death toward an unknown sea in seemingly hopeless search for Vapaja, where Duer's father, Mintep, ruled. Months passed. I commenced to fear that Napier had crashed in his new ship, and then I began to have messages from him again which I shall record for the benefit of posterity as nearly in his own words as I can recall them. Disaster. Everyone who has ever flown will recall the thrill of his first flight over familiar terrain, viewing the old scenes from a new angle that imparted a strangeness and a mystery to them as of a new world, but always there was the comforting knowledge that the airport was not too far away and that even in the event of a forced landing one would know pretty well where he was and how to get home. But that dawn that Duer and I took off from Havatu to the accompaniment of the staccato hum of Amtorian rifles, I was actually flying over an unknown world, and there was no landing field and no home. I believe that this was the happiest and most thrilling moment of my life. The woman I love had just told me that she loved me. I was once again at the controls of a ship, I was free, I was flying in safety above the innumerable menaces that haunt the Amtorian scene. Undoubtedly, other dangers lay ahead of us in our seemingly hopeless quest for Vapaja, but for the moment there was nothing to mar our happiness or arouse forebodings. At least, not in me. With Duer it may have been a little different. She may have had forebodings of disaster. It would not be strange if she had, for up until the very instant that we rose to top the walls of Havatu she had had no conception that there might exist any contrivance in which man might leave the ground and fly through the air. It was naturally something of a shock to her, but she was very brave, and content, too, to accept my word that we were safe. The ship was a model of perfection, such a ship as will one day be common along the airways of old Earth when science has progressed there as far as it has in Havatu. Synthetic materials of extreme strength and lightness entered into her construction. The scientists of Havatu assured me that she would have a life of at least 50 years without overhaul or repairs other than what might be required because of accident. The engine was noiseless and efficient beyond the dreams of Earthmen. Fuel for the life of the ship was aboard, and it took up very little space, for it could all be held in the palm of one hand. This apparent miracle is scientifically simple of explanation. Our own scientists are aware of the fact that the energy released by combustion is only an infinitesimal fraction of that which might be generated by the total annihilation of a substance. In the case of coal it is as 18,000 millions are to 1. The fuel for my engine consists of a substance known as law. which contains an element called Yorsan, as yet unknown to Earthmen, and another element, Vikro, the action of which upon Yorsan results in absolute annihilation of the law. Insofar as the operation of the ship was concerned, we might have flown on for 50 years, barring adverse weather conditions, but our weakness lay in the fact that we had no provisions. The precipitancy of our departure had precluded any possibility of provisioning the ship. We had escaped with our lives and what we had on, and that was all, but we were very happy. I didn't want to spoil it by questioning the future. But, really, we had a great many questions to ask of the future, and Duer presently raised one quite innocently enough. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To look for Vapaja," I told her. "I am going to try to take you home." She shook her head. "No, we can't go there." "But that is the one place you have been longing to go ever since you were kidnapped by the Klangan," I reminded her. "But not now, Carson. My father, the Jong, would have you destroyed. We have spoken of love to one another, and no man may speak of love to the daughter of the Jong of Vapaja before she is 20. You know that well enough." "I certainly should," I teased her. "You have told me often enough." "I did it for your own safety, but nevertheless I always liked to hear you say it," she admitted. "From the first?" I asked. "From the first. I have loved you from the first, Carson." "You are an adept at dissimulation. I thought you hated me, and yet, sometimes I wondered. And because I love you, you must never fall into the hands of my father." "But where can we go, Duer? Do you know a single spot in all this world where we should be safe?" "There is none, and in Vapaja you, at least, will be safe. I shall have to take the chance of winning your father over." "It could never be done," she declared. "The unwritten law that decrees this thing is as old as the ancient empire of Vapaja. You have told me of the gods and goddesses of the religions of your world. In Vapaja the royal family occupies a similar position in the minds and hearts of the people, and this is especially true of the virgin daughter of a Jong. She is absolutely sacrosanct. To look at her is an offense, to speak to her is a crime punishable by death." "It's a crazy law," I snapped. "Where would you be now, had I abided by its dictates, dead? I should think your father would feel some obligation toward me." "As a father, he would, but not as a Jong." "And I suppose he is a Jong first," I said, a little bitterly. "Yes, he is a Jong first, and so we may not return to Vapaja," she said with finality. What an ironical trick fate had played upon me. With many opportunities in two worlds to pick a girl for me to fall in love with, she had ended up by choosing a goddess. It was tough, yet I wouldn't have had it otherwise. To have loved Duer, and to know that she loved me, was better than a lifetime with any other woman. Duer's decision that we must not return to Vapaja had left me in something of a quandary. Of course I didn't know that I could have found Vapaja anyway, but at least it was something to aim at. Now I had nothing. Havatu was the grandest city I had ever seen, but the unbelievable decision of the judges who had examined Duer after I had rescued her from the city of the dead, and our escape, made it impossible for us ever to return. To hunt for a hospitable city in this strange world seemed useless and hopeless. Venus is a world of contradictions, anomalies, and paradoxes. In the midst of scenes of peace and beauty, one meets the most fearsome beasts. Among a friendly, cultured people exist senseless and barbarous customs. In a city peopled by men and women of superintelligence and sweetness, the quality of mercy is utterly unknown to its tribunals. What hope had I, then, of finding a safe retreat for Duer and myself? I determined then to return Duer to Vapaja, that she, at least, might be saved. We were flying south along the course of Gerlat Kumrov, the river of death, toward the sea to which I knew the waters must eventually guide me. I was flying low, as both Duer and I wished to see the country rolling majestically beneath us. There were forests and hills and plains and, in the distance, mountains, while over all, like the roof of a colossal tent, stretched the inner cloud envelope that entirely surrounds the planet, and which, with the outer cloud bank, tempers the heat of the sun and makes life possible on Venus. We saw herds of animals grazing on the plains, but we saw no cities and no men. It was a vast wilderness that stretched below us, beautiful but deadly, typically Amtorian. Our course was due south, and I believed that when we reached the sea we would but have to continue on across it to find Vapaja. Knowing that Vapaja was an island, and always having in mind that someday I might wish to return to it, I had designed my ship with retractable pontoons as well as ordinary landing gear. The sight of the herds below us suggested food and stimulated my appetite. I asked Due if she were hungry. She said she was very, but asked what good it would do her. "There's our dinner down there," I said, pointing. "Yes, but by the time we get down there it will be gone," she said. "Wait till they catch a glimpse of this thing. There won't be one of them within miles by the time you get this thing on the ground unless it scares some of them to death." She didn't say miles, of course, she said Klukob, Cob being a unit of distance equivalent to 2.5 Earth miles, the prefix Klu denoting the plural. But she did say this thing in Amtorian. "Please don't call my beautiful ship this thing," I begged. "But it is not a ship," she demurred. "A ship goes on water. I have a name for it, Carson, it is an Anotar." "Splendid!" I applauded. Anotar it shall be. It was a good name, too, for nota means ship, and an is the Amtorian word for bird, birdship. I thought this better than airship, possibly because Due had coined it. I had an elevation of about 1,000 feet, but as my motor was absolutely noiseless, none of the animals beneath us was yet aware of the strange thing hovering above them. As I started to spiral downward, Due gave a little gasp and touched my arm. She didn't seize it, as some women might have, she just touched it, as though the contact gave her assurance. It must have been rather a terrifying experience for one who had never even seen an airship before that morning. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going down after our dinner. Don't be frightened." She said no more, but she still kept her hand on my arm. We were dropping rapidly when suddenly one of the grazing animals looked up, and, at sight of us, gave a loud snort of warning and went careening off across the plain. Then they all stampeded. I straightened out and went after them, dropping down until I was just above their backs. At the altitude at which we had been flying, the ground speed had probably seemed slow to her, so that now that we were but a few feet above ground it surprised her to find that we could easily outdistance the fleetest of the racing beasts. I do not consider that it is very sporting to shoot animals from an airplane, but I was not indulging in sport, I was after food, and this was about the only way that I could get it without endangering our lives by stalking on foot, so it was without compunction that I drew my pistol and brought down a fat young yearling of some strange herbivorous species unknown to our world. At least, I guess it was a yearling, it looked as though it should be. The chase had brought us quite close to a fringe of forest that grew along the banks of a tributary of the River of Death, so that I had to bank quite sharply to avoid piling up among the trees. When I glanced at Due she was quite white, but she was keeping a stiff upper lip. By the time I landed beside my kill, the plane was deserted. Leaving Due in the cockpit, I got out to bleed and butcher the animal. It was my intention to cut off as much meat as I thought would remain fresh until we could use it and then take off and fly to a more suitable temporary campsite. I was working close beside the plane, and neither Due nor I faced the forest which lay but a short distance behind us. Of course, we were careless in not maintaining a better watch, but I suppose we were both intent on my butchering operations, which, I must admit, were doubtless strange and wonderful to behold. The first intimation I had of impending danger was a frightened cry of Carson, from Due. As I wheeled toward her, I saw fully a dozen warriors coming for me. 3 of them were right on top of me with raised swords. I saw no chance of defending myself, and went down beneath those swords like a felled ox, but not before the brief glimpse I had of my attackers revealed the astonishing fact that they were all women. I must have lain there unconscious for more than an hour, and when I regained consciousness I found myself alone. The warriors and duer were gone. 2. Warrior women. I came at that moment to being as nearly spiritually crushed as I ever had been before in my life. To have duer and happiness snatched from me after a few brief hours, at the very threshold of comparative security, completely unnerved me for the moment. It was the more serious aspect of the situation that gave me control of myself once more, the fate of duer. I was pretty badly mussed up. My head and the upper part of my body were caked with dried blood from several nasty sword cuts. Why I had not been killed I shall never understand, and I am certain that my attackers had left me for dead. My wounds were quite severe, but none of them was lethal. My skull was intact, but my head ached frightfully, and I was weak from shock and loss of blood. An examination of the ship showed that it had not been damaged or tampered with, and as I glanced around the plane I saw that which convinced me that its presence there had doubtless saved my life, for there were several savage-appearing beasts pacing to and fro some 100 yards away eyeing me hungrily. It must have been the, to them, strange monster standing guard over me that kept them at bay. The brief glimpse I had had of the warrior women suggested that they were not mere savages but had attained at least some degree of civilization. Their apparel and arms bespoke that. From this I assumed that they must live in a village, and as they were on foot, it was reasonable to suppose that their village was at no great distance. I was sure that they must have come out of the forest behind the ship and therefore that it was in this direction I must search for duer first. We had seen no village before landing, as it seemed almost certain that we should have had one of any size existed within a few miles of our position, for both of us had been constantly on the lookout for signs of the presence of human beings. To prosecute my search on foot, especially in view of the presence of the savage carnivores hungrily anticipating me, would have been the height of foolishness, and if the village of the warrior women were in the open I could find it more quickly and more easily from the plain. I was rather weak and dizzy as I took my place at the controls, and only such an emergency as now confronted me could have forced me into the air in the condition in which I was. However, I made a satisfactory takeoff, and once in the air my mind was so occupied by my search that I almost forgot my hurts. I flew low over the forest and as silently as a bird on the wing. If there were a village and if it were built in the forest, it might be difficult or even impossible to locate it from the air, but because of the noiselessness of my ship it might be possible to locate a village by sound could I fly low enough. The forest was not of great extent, and I soon spanned it, but I saw no village nor any sign of one. Beyond the forest was a range of hills, and through a pass in them I saw a well-worn trail. This I followed, but I saw no village, though the landscape lay spread before me for miles around. The hills were cut with little canyons and valleys. It was rough country where one would least expect to find a village, and so I gave up the search in this direction and turned the nose of my ship back toward the plain where duer had been captured, intending to start my search from there in another direction. I was still flying very low, covering once more the ground I had just been over, when my attention was attracted by the figure of a human being walking rapidly across a level mesa. Dropping still lower, I saw that it was a man. He was walking very rapidly and constantly casting glances behind. He had not discovered the ship. Evidently he was too much concerned with whatever was behind him, and presently I saw what it was, one of those ferocious lion-like creatures of Amta, a Tharban. The beast was stalking him, but I knew that it would soon charge, and so I dropped quickly in a steep dive. Nor was I a moment too soon. As the beast charged, the man turned to face it with his pitifully inadequate spear, for he must have known that flight was futile. I had drawn my Amtorian pistol, charged with its deadly RA, and as I flattened out just above the Tharban, narrowly missing a crack-up, I let him have it. I think it was more luck than skill that permitted me to hit him at all, and as he rolled over and over on the ground, I banked, circled the man and made a landing behind him. He was the first human being I had seen since the capture of duer, and I wanted to question him. He was alone, armed only with primitive weapons, and, so, absolutely in my power. I don't know why he didn't run away, for that airship must have been an appalling thing to him, but he stood his ground even as I taxied up and stopped near him. It may have been that he was just paralyzed by fright. He was a small, rather insignificant-looking fellow wearing a loincloth so voluminous as to appear almost a short skirt. About his throat were several necklaces of colored stones and beads, while armlets, bracelets, and anklets similarly fabricated adorned his limbs. His long black hair was coiled in 2 knots, one upon either temple, and these were ornamented with tiny, colored feathers stuck into them like arrows in a target. He carried a sword, a spear, and a hunting knife. As I descended from the ship and approached him, he backed away, and his spear arm started back menacingly. "Who are you?" he asked. "I don't want to kill you, but if you come any closer I'll have to." "What do you want?" "I don't want to harm you," I assured him, "I just want to talk to you." We spoke in the universal language of Amter. "What do you want to talk to me about? But first tell me why you killed the Tharban that was about to kill and eat me." "So that it wouldn't kill and eat you." He shook his head. "That is strange. You do not know me, we are not friends, so why should you wish to save my life?" "Because we are both men," I told him. "That is a good idea," he admitted. "If all men felt that way we would be treated better than we are. But even then, many of us would be afraid. What is that thing you were riding in? I can see now that it is not alive. Why does it not fall to the ground and kill you?" I had neither the time nor inclination to explain the science of aerodromics to him, so I told him it stayed up because I made it stay up. "You must be a very wonderful man," he said admiringly. "What is your name?" "Carson, and yours?" "Lulla," he replied, and then, "Carson is a strange name for a man. It sounds more like a woman's name." "More so than Lulla?" I asked, restraining a smile. "Oh, yes, Lulla is a very masculine name. I think it is a very sweet name, too, don't you?" "Very," I assured him. "Where do you live, Lulla?" He pointed in the direction from which I had just come after abandoning hope of finding a village there. "I live in the village of Hutamai that is in the narrow canyon." "How far is it?" "About 2 klukob," he estimated. 2 klukob. That would be 5 miles of our system of linear measurement, and I had flown back and forth over that area repeatedly and hadn't seen any sign of a village. "A little while ago I saw a band of warrior women with swords and spears," I said. "Do you know where they live?" "They might live in Hutamai," he said, "or in one of several other villages." "Oh, we Samai have many villages, we are very powerful." Was one of the women large and powerful and with a deep scar on the left side of her face? I really didn't have much opportunity to observe them closely, I told him. "Well, perhaps not. If you'd gotten too close to them you'd be dead now, but I thought maybe Bund might have been with them, then I would have known that they were from Hutamai. Bund, you see, is my mate. She is very strong, and really should be chief." He said Jong, which means king, but chief seems a better title for the leader of a savage tribe, and from my brief intercourse with the ladies of the Samoi I could vouch for their savagery. "Will you take me to Hutamai?" I asked. "Oh, mercy, no," he cried. "They'd kill you, and after your having saved my life I couldn't think of exposing you to danger." "Why would they want to kill me?" I demanded. "I never did anything to them and don't intend to." "That doesn't mean anything to the women of the Samoi," he assured me. "They don't like men very well, and they kill every strange man they find in our country. They'd kill us, too, if they weren't afraid the tribe would become extinct. They do kill some of us occasionally, if they get mad enough. Bun tried to kill me yesterday, but I could run too fast for her." I got away, and I've been hiding out since. I think perhaps she's gotten over her anger by now, so I'm going to sneak back and see. Suppose they captured a strange woman, I asked, what would they do with her? They'd make a slave of her and make her work for them. Would they treat her well? They don't treat anyone well except themselves, they live on the fat of the land, he said, resentfully. But they wouldn't kill her? I asked. You don't think they'd do that, do you? He shrugged. They might. Their tempers are very short, and if a slave makes a mistake, she'd certainly be beaten. Often they beat them to death. Are you very fond of Bund? I asked him. Fond of Bund? Who ever heard of a man being fond of a woman? I hate her. I hate them all. But what can I do about it? I must live. If I went to another country, I'd be killed. If I stay here and try to please Bund, I am fed and protected and have a place to sleep. And then, too, we men do have a little fun once in a while. We can sit around and talk while we're making sandals and loincloths, and sometimes we play games, that is, when the women are out hunting or raiding. Oh, it's better than being dead, anyhow. I'm in trouble, Lila, and I'm wondering if you won't help me. You know we men should stick together. What do you want me to do? He demanded. I want you to lead me to the village of Hutamai. He looked at me suspiciously, and hesitated. Don't forget that I saved your life, I reminded him. That's right, he said. I do owe you something, a debt of gratitude, at least. But why do you want to go to Hutamai? I want to see if my mate is there. She was stolen by some warrior women this morning. Well, why do you want to get her back? I wish someone would steal Bund. You wouldn't understand, Lila, I told him, but I certainly do want to get her back. Will you help me? I could take you as far as the mouth of the narrow canyon, he said, but I couldn't take you into the village. They'd kill us both. They'll kill you when you get there, anyway. If you had black hair you might escape notice, but that funny yellow hair of yours would give you away the very first thing. Now, if you had black hair, you could sneak in after dark and come into one of the men's caves. That way you might escape notice for a long time. Even if some of the women saw you, they wouldn't know the difference. They don't pay much attention to any but their own men. But wouldn't the men give me away? No, they'd think it was a great joke, fooling the women. If you were found out, we'd just say you fooled us, too. My, I wish you had black hair. I, too, wish then that I had black hair, if that would help me get into the village of Hutamai. Presently, a plan occurred to me. Lila, I asked, did you ever see an Ainotar before, nodding toward the ship? He shook his head. Never. Want to have a look at it? He said he'd like to, so I climbed into the cockpit, inviting him to follow me. When he had seated himself beside me, I buckled the safety belt across him to demonstrate it as I was explaining its purpose. Would you like to take a ride? I asked. Up in the air, he demanded. Mercy, I should say not. Well, just along the ground, then. Just a little way along the ground. Yes, I promised, just a little way along the ground, and I wasn't lying to him. I taxied around until we were headed into the wind, then I gave her the gun. Not so fast, he screamed, and he tried to jump out, but he didn't know how to unfasten the safety belt. He was so busy with it that he didn't look up for several seconds. When he did, we were 100 feet off the ground and climbing rapidly. He gave one look, screamed, and closed his eyes. You lied to me, he cried. You said we'd go just a little way along the ground. We ran only a little way along the ground, I insisted. I didn't promise that I wouldn't go into the air. It was a cheap trick, I'll admit, but there was more than life at stake for me, and I knew that the fellow was perfectly safe. You needn't be afraid, I reassured him. It's perfectly safe. I've flown millions of Klukob in perfect safety. Open your eyes and look around. You'll get used to it in a minute or two, and then you'll like it. He did as I bid, and though he gasped a bit at first, he soon became interested and was craning his neck in all directions looking for familiar landmarks. You're safer here than you would be on the ground, I told him. Neither the women nor the Tharbans can get you. That's right, he admitted. And you should be very proud, too, Lila. Why? He demanded. As far as I know, you're the third human being ever to fly in the air in Amta, excepting the Klangan, and I don't count them as human anyway. No, he said, they're not, they're birds that can talk. Where are you taking me? We're there. I'm coming down now. I was circling above the plane where I had made the kill before Duer was stolen. A couple of beasts were feeding on the carcass, but they took fright and ran away as the ship dropped near them for a landing. Jumping out, I cut strips of fat from the carcass, threw them into the cockpit, climbed in and took off. By this time, Lila was an enthusiastic aeronaut, and if it hadn't been for the safety belt he would have fallen out in one of his enthusiastic attempts to see everything in all directions at one and the same time. Suddenly, he realized that we were not flying in the direction of Hutamai. Hey, he cried. You're going in the wrong direction, Hutamai is over there. Where are you going? I'm going to get black hair, I told him. He gave me a frightened look. I guess he thought he was up in the air with a maniac, then he subsided, but he kept watching me out of the corner of an eye. I flew back to the River of Death, where I recalled having seen a low, flat island, and, dropping my pontoons, landed on the water and taxied into a little cove that indented the island. I managed, after a little maneuvering, to get ashore with a rope and tie the ship to a small tree, then I got Lila to come ashore and build me a fire. I could have done it myself, but these primitive men accomplish it with far greater celerity than I ever could acquire. From a bush I gathered a number of large, wax-like leaves. When the fire was burning well, I took most of the fat and dropped it in piece by piece and very laboriously and slowly accumulated soot on the waxy faces of the leaves. It took much longer than I had hoped it would, but at last I had enough for my purpose. Mixing the soot with a small quantity of the remaining fat, I rubbed it thoroughly into my hair, while Lila watched me with a broadening grin. From time to time I used the still surface of the cove for a mirror, and when I had completed the transformation I washed the soot from my hands and face, using the ashes of the fire to furnish the necessary light to cut the greasy mess. At the same time, I washed the blood from my face and body. Now I not only looked, but felt, like a new man. I was rather amazed to realize that during all the excitement of the day I had almost forgotten my wounds. Now, Lila, I said, climb aboard and we'll see if we can find Hutamai. The takeoff from the river was rather exciting for the Amtorian, as I had to make a very long run of it because of the smoothness of the water, throwing spray in all directions, but at last we were in the air and headed for Hutamai. We had a little difficulty in locating the narrow canyon because from this new vantage point the ordinarily familiar terrain took on a new aspect for Lila, but at last he gave a yell and pointed down. I looked and saw a narrow canyon with steep walls, but I saw no village. Where's the village? I asked. Right there, replied Lila, but still I could not see it, but you can't see the caves very well from here. Then I understood Hutamai was a village of cave dwellers. No wonder I had flown over it many times without recognizing it. I circled several times studying the terrain carefully, and also watching the time. I knew that it must be quite close to sundown, and I had a plan. I wanted Lila to go into the canyon with me and show me the cave in which he dwelt. Alone, I could never have found it. I was afraid that if I brought him to the ground too soon he might take it into his head to leave for home at once, then there would have been trouble, and I might have lost his help and cooperation. I had found what I considered a relatively safe place to leave the ship, and as night was falling I brought her into a beautiful landing. Taxiing to a group of trees, I tied her down as best I could, but I certainly hated to go off and leave that beautiful thing alone in this savage country. I was not much concerned for fear that any beast would damage it. I was sure they would be too much afraid of it to go near it for a long while, but I didn't know what some ignorant human savages might do to it if they found it there. However, there was nothing else to be done. Lula and I reached the narrow canyon well after dark. It was not a very pleasant trip, what with savage hunting beasts roaring and growling in all directions and Lula trying to elude me. He was commencing to regret his rash promises of help and think of what would certainly happen to him if it were discovered that he had brought a strange man into the village. I had to keep constantly reassuring him that I would protect him and swear by all that an Amtorian holds holy that I had never seen him, in the event that I should be questioned by the women. We reached the foot of the cliff, in which the caves of the Hutamayans were carved, without exciting incident. Some fires were burning on the ground, 2 fires, a large one and a small one. Around the large fire were grouped a number of strapping women, squatting, lying, standing. They shouted and laughed in loud tones as they tore at pieces of some animal that had been cooking over the fire. Around the smaller fire sat a few little men. They were very quiet, and when they spoke, it was in low tones. Occasionally, one of them would giggle, and then they would all look apprehensively in the direction of the women, but the latter paid no more attention to them than as though they had been so many guinea pigs. To this group of men, Lula led me. Say nothing, he warned his unwelcome guest, and try not to call attention to yourself. I kept to the rear of those gathered about the fire, seeking always to keep my face in shadow. I heard the men greet Lula, and from their manner I judged that a bond of friendship, welded from their common misery and degradation, united them. I looked about in search of Due, but saw nothing of her. "How is Bun's humor?" I heard Lula inquire. "As bad as ever," replied one of the men. "Were the raids and the hunting good today?" "Did you hear any of the women say?" continued Lula. "They were good," came the reply. "There is plenty of meat now, and Bund brought in a woman slave that she captured. There was a man with her, whom they killed, and the strangest contraption that anyone ever beheld. I think even the women were a little afraid of it from what they said. At any rate, they evidently got away from it as quickly as they could." "Oh, I know what that was," said Lula, "it was an Anotar." "How do you know what it was?" demanded one of the men. "Why, can't you take a joke?" demanded Lula in a weak voice. I smiled as I realized how nearly Lula's vanity had caused him to betray himself. It was evident that while he may have trusted his friends, he did not therefore trust them implicitly. And I smiled also from relief, for I knew now that I had come to the right village and that Due was here, but where? I wanted to question these men, but if Lula could not trust them, how might I? I wanted to stand up and shout Due's name. I wanted her to know that I was here, eager to serve her. She must think me dead, and, knowing Due as I did, I knew that she might take her own life because of hopelessness and despair. I must get word to her somehow. I edged toward Lula, and when I was close to him whispered in his ear. "Come away. I want to talk to you," I said. "Go away. I don't know you," whispered Lula. "You bet you know me, and if you don't come with me, I'll tell Emil where you've been all afternoon and that you brought me here." "Oh, you wouldn't do that." Lula was trembling. "Then come with me." "All right," said Lula, and rising walked off into the shadows beyond the fire. I pointed toward the women. "Is Bund there?" I asked. "Yes, the big brute with her back toward us," replied Lula. "Would her new slave be in Bund's cave?" "Probably." "Alone?" I asked. "No, another slave whom Bund could trust would be watching her, so that she couldn't escape." "Where is Bund's cave?" "High up, on the 3rd terrace." "Take me to it," I directed. Are you crazy, or do you think I am? Demanded Lula. You are allowed on the cliff, aren't you? Yes, but I wouldn't go to Bun's cave unless she sent for me. You don't have to go there, just come with me far enough to point it out to me. He hesitated, scratching his head. Well, he said, finally, that's as good a way as any to get rid of you, but don't forget that you promised not to tell them that it was I who brought you to the village. I followed him up a rickety ladder to the first and then to the second level, but as we were about to ascend to the third, two women started down from above. Lula became panicky. Come, he whispered nervously and took me by the arm. He led me along a precarious footwalk that ran in front of the caves and to the far end of it. Trembling, he halted here. That was a narrow escape, he whispered. Even with your black hair you don't look much like a Samarian man. You're as big and strong as a woman, and that thing hanging at your side that would give you away. No one else has one. You'd better throw it away. He referred to my pistol, the only weapon I had brought, with the exception of a good hunting knife. The suggestion was as bizarre as Lula was naive. He was right in saying that its possession might reveal my imposture, but on the other hand its absence might ensure my early demise. I did manage to arrange it, however, so that it was pretty well covered by my loincloth. As we were standing on the runway waiting for the two women to get safely out of the way, I looked down upon the scene below, my interest centering principally upon the group of women surrounding the larger fire. They were strapping specimens, broad-shouldered, deep-chested, with the sturdy limbs of gladiators. Their hoarse voices rose in laughter, profanity, and coarse jokes. The firelight played upon their almost naked bodies and their rugged, masculine faces, revealing them distinctly to me. They were not unhandsome, with their short hair and bronzed skins, but even though their figures were, in a modified way, those of women, there seemed not even a trace of femininity among them. One just could not think of them as women, and that was all there was to it. As I watched them, two of them got into an altercation. They started by calling each other vile names, then they went at it hammer and tongs, and they didn't fight like women. There was no hair pulling or scratching there. They fought like a couple of ice men. How different the other group around the smaller fire. With mouse-like timidity they furtively watched the fight from a distance. Compared with their women, their bodies were small and frail, their voices soft, their manner apologetic. Lula and I didn't wait to ascertain the outcome of the fight. The two women who had interrupted our ascent passed down to a lower level, leaving us free to climb to the next runway where Bun's cave was located. When we stood upon the catwalk of the third level, Lula told me that Bun's cave was the third to my left. That done, he was ready to leave me. Where are the men's caves? I asked him before he could get away. On the highest level. And yours? The last cave to the left of the ladder, he said. I'm going there now. I hope I never see you again. His voice was shaking and he was trembling like a leaf. It didn't seem possible that a man could be reduced to such a pitiable state of abject terror, and by a woman. Yet he had faced the Tharban with a real show of courage. With a shake of my head I turned toward the cave of Bund, the warrior woman of Hutamai. 3. Caves of Hutamai. Tiki catwalks before the caves of the cliff dwellers of Hutamai seemed most inadequate, but they served their purpose, and I suppose the dwellers there, being accustomed to nothing different, were content with them. Their construction was simple but practical. Into holes bored in the face of the sandstone cliff, straight tree limbs had been driven projecting about 2 feet from the cliff. These were braced by other pieces, the lower ends of which rested in notches cut about 2 feet below the holes. Along the tops of these brackets, poles had been laid and lashed down with rawhide. The runway seemed rather narrow when one glanced down the face of the precipitous cliff, and there were no handrails. I couldn't help but think how embarrassing it might be to get into a fight on one of these catwalks. As these thoughts passed through my mind, I made my way to the mouth of the third cave to my left. All as quiet and the interior as dark as a pocket. Hey! In there, I called. Presently a sleepy feminine voice answered. Who's that? What do you want? Bund wants her new slave sent down, I said. I heard someone moving inside the cave, and almost immediately a woman with disheveled hair crawled to the entrance. I knew that it was too dark for her to recognize features. All that I could hope for was that she would be too sleepy to have her suspicions aroused by my voice, which I didn't think sounded like the voices of the men I had heard talking. I hoped not, anyway. However, I tried to change it as much as I could, aping Lula's soft tones. What does Bund want of her? She asked. How should I know? I demanded. It's very funny, she said. Bund told me distinctly that I was not to let her out of the cave under any circumstances. Oh, here comes Bund now. I glanced down. The fight was over, and the women were ascending to their caves. To me that catwalk in front of Bund's cave looked like a most unhealthy place to loiter, and I knew that it would be impossible at this time to do anything for Duer, so I made my exit as gracefully and as quickly as I could. I guess Bund changed her mind, I told the woman, as I turned back toward the ladder that led to the upper catwalk. Fortunately for me the slave woman was still half asleep, and doubtless her principal concern at the moment was to get back to her slumbers. She mumbled something about its being very odd, but before she could go deeper into the matter with me I was on my way. It didn't take me long to clamber the rickety ladder to the catwalk in front of the men's caves and make my way to the last one to the left of the ladder. The interior was as dark as a pocket and smelled as though it needed airing and had needed it for several generations. Lula! I whispered. I heard a groan. You again? Asked a querulous voice. Your old friend, Carson himself, I replied. You don't seem glad to see me. I'm not. I hoped I'd never see you again. I hoped you'd be killed. Why weren't you killed? You didn't stay there long enough. Why did you come away? I had to come up and see my old friend, Lula, I said. And then you will go right away again. Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. I certainly hope tomorrow. He groaned again. Don't let them see you coming out of this cave tomorrow, he begged. Oh, why did I tell you where my cave was? That was very stupid of you, Lula, but don't worry. I won't get you in any trouble if you help me. Help you? Help you get your mate away from Bund? Why, Bund would kill me. Well, let's not worry about it until tomorrow. We both need sleep. But say, Lula, don't betray me. If you do, I'll tell Bund the whole story. One more thing. Do you occupy this cave alone? No. 2 other men are with me. They'll probably be up soon. Don't talk to me any more after they come. You think they'd give us away? I don't know, he admitted, but I'm not going to take any chances. After this we relapsed into silence. It wasn't long before we heard footsteps outside, and a moment later the other 2 men entered the cave. They had been carrying on a conversation, and they brought the tail end of it in with them. Beat me, so I didn't say any more about it, but just before we came up I heard the women talking about it. Nearly all were in their caves at the time. It was just before we went down to build the fires for the last meal, just before darkness came. I had come out of the cave to go down when I happened to look up and see it. Why did your woman beat you? She said I was lying and that she didn't like liars, that she couldn't abide them and that if I'd tell a silly lie like that I'd lie about anything, but now 2 of the women said they saw it. What did your woman say to that? She said I probably had a beating coming to me anyway. What did the thing look like? Like a big bird, only it didn't flap its wings. It flew right over the canyon. The women who saw it said it was the same thing they saw sitting on the ground when they captured the new slave today and killed the yellow-haired man. That thing must have been the Anotar that Lila spoke of. But he said he was only joking. How could he joke about something he'd never seen? There's something funny about this. Hey, Lila. There was no response. Hey, you, Lila, the man called again. I'm asleep, said Lila. Then you'd better wake up. We want to know about this Anotar, insisted the man. I don't know anything about it, I never saw it, I never went up in it. Whoever said you went up in it? How could a man go up in the air in anything? It can't be done. Oh, yes it can, exclaimed Lila. 2 men can ride in it, maybe 4. It flies all around wherever you want it to go. I thought you didn't know anything about it. I am going asleep, announced Lila. You're going to tell us all about that Anotar, or I'll tell Bund on you. Oh, Vila. You wouldn't do that, cried Lila. Yes, I would so, insisted Vila. You'd better tell us everything. If I do, will you promise not to tell anyone? I promise. And you, Ellie? Will you promise? Asked Lila. I wouldn't tell anyone on you, Lila, you ought to know that, Ellie assured him. Now, go on and tell us. Well, I have seen it, and I've ridden in it way up in the sky. Now you are lying, Lila, chided Vila. Honest to gracious, I'm not, insisted Lila, and if you don't believe me, ask Carson. I had been expecting the nitwit to spill the beans, so I wasn't greatly surprised. I think that if Lila had had an IQ rating it would have been about decimal 2. And who is Carson? Demanded Vila. He makes the Anotar go in the air, explained Lila. Well, how can we ask him? I think you are lying again, Lila. You are getting into a bad habit of lying, lately. I am not lying, and if you don't believe me you can ask Carson. He's right here in this cave. What? Demanded the 2, in unison. Lila is not lying, I said. I am here, also, Lila rode in the Anotar with me. If you 2 would like to ride, I'll take you up tomorrow if you can get me out of here without the women seeing me. For a while there was silence, then Ellie spoke in a rather frightened voice. What would Jad say if she knew about this? He asked. Jad was the chief. You promised not to tell, Lila reminded him. Jad needn't know, unless one of you tells her, I said, and if you do, I'll say that all 3 of you knew it and that you were trying to get me to kill her. Oh, you wouldn't say that, would you? Cried Ellie. I certainly would. But if you'll help me, no one need ever know, and you can get a ride in the Anotar to boot. I'd be afraid, said Ellie. It's nothing to be afraid of, said Lila in a voice that swaggered. I wasn't afraid. You see the whole world all at once, and nothing can get at you. I'd like to stay up there all the time. I wouldn't be afraid of the Tharbans then, I wouldn't even be afraid of Bund. I'd like to go up, said Vila. If Lila wasn't afraid, nobody would be. If you go up, I will, promised Ellie. I'll go, said Vila. Well, we talked a little longer, then, before going to sleep, I asked some questions about the habits of the women, and found that the hunting and raiding parties went out the first thing in the morning and that they left a small guard of warrior women to protect the village. I also learned that the slaves came down in the morning and while the hunting and raiding parties were out, gathered wood for the fires and brought water to the caves in clay jugs. They also helped the men with the making of sandals, loincloths, ornaments, and pottery. The next morning I stayed in the cave until after the hunters and raiders had left, then I descended the ladders to the ground. I had learned enough about the women to be reasonably certain that I would not arouse their suspicions, as their men are so self-effacing and the women ignore them so completely that a woman might recognize scarcely any of the men other than her mate. But I was not so sure about the men. They all knew one another. What they might do when they recognized a stranger among them was impossible to foresee. Half a dozen warrior women were loitering in a group near the middle of the canyon while the men and slaves busied themselves with their allotted duties. I saw some of them eyeing me as I reached the ground and walked toward a group down canyon from them where a number of female slaves were working, but they did not accost me. I kept away from the men as much as possible and approached the female slaves. I was looking for Duer. My heart sank as I saw no sign of her, and I wished that I had gone first to Bun's cave to look for her. Some of the slaves looked at me questioningly, then one of them spoke to me. "Who are you?" she demanded. "You ought to know," I told her, and while she was puzzling that one out, I walked on. Presently I saw some slaves emerging from a little side gully with armfuls of wood, and among them I recognized Duer. My heart leaped at sight of her. I sauntered to a point at which she would have to pass me, waiting for the expression in those dear eyes when she should recognize me. Closer and closer she came, and the nearer she got the harder my heart pounded. When she was a couple of steps away, she glanced up into my face, then she passed on without a sign of recognition. For an instant I was crushed, then I was angry, and I turned and overtook her. "Duer," I whispered. She stopped and wheeled toward me. "Carson," she exclaimed. "Oh, Carson. What has happened to you?" I had forgotten the black hair and the ugly wounds on my forehead and cheek, the latter an ugly gash from temple to chin. She actually had not known me. "Oh, but you are not dead, you are not dead. I thought that they had killed you. Tell me." "Not now, dear," I said. "We're going to get out of here first." "But how? What chance have we to escape while they are watching?" "Simply run away. I don't think we'll ever have a better chance." I glanced quickly about. The warriors were still unconcerned, paying no attention to us or anyone else. They were superior beings who looked with contempt upon men and slaves. Most of the slaves and men were farther up canyon than we, but there were a few that we would have to pass. "Are you going back for more wood?" I asked. "Yes, we are," she told me. "Good. When you come back, try to walk at the very rear of the others. I'll follow you into the canyon, if I can, unless a better plan occurs to me. You'd better go on now." After she left me, I boldly sought out Lila. The men who looked at me eyed me suspiciously, but they are so stupid that they were at first merely puzzled. They didn't think of doing anything about it. I hoped that when they did, it would be too late to interfere with my plans. When I found Lila and he saw who it was, he looked about as happy as he would had he suddenly been confronted by a ghost. "Get Viola and Ellie," I told him, "and come with me." "What for?" he demanded. "Never mind. Do as I tell you, and do it quickly, or I'll tell those women." He was too dumb to realize immediately that I wouldn't dare do that, so he went and got Ellie and Viola. "What do you want of us?" demanded the latter. "I'm going to take you for that ride in the Ainotar, just as I promised you last night," I said. They looked at each other questioningly. I could see that they were afraid, probably frightened by the thought of flying, but more frightened of the women. Ellie choked. "I can't go today," he said. "You are coming with me whether you go up in the Ainotar or not," I told them in no uncertain tones. "What do you want of us?" asked Viola. "Come with me, and I'll show you. And don't forget that if you don't do as I tell you, I'll tell the women about that plan of yours to have me kill Jad. Now, come." "You're a mean old thing," whined Viola. They had been kicked around so much all their lives and had developed such colossal inferiority complexes that they were afraid of everybody, and, if they weren't given too much time to think, would obey anyone's commands, so they came with me. The wood carriers had laid down their loads and were on their way back to the side gully for more as I herded my unwilling accomplices toward a point the slaves would have to pass, and as they approached, I saw, to my vast relief, that Duer was trailing the others. As she came opposite us, I gathered my three around her to hide her, if possible, from the sight of the warrior women, then I directed them at a loitering gait downward toward the mouth of the narrow canyon. Right then I would have given a lot for a rear sight mirror, for I wanted to see what was going on behind us, but didn't dare look back for fear of suggesting that we were doing something we shouldn't be. It was a case of nonchalance or nothing, and not a cigarette of any brand among us. I never knew minutes to be so long, but finally we approached the lower end of the canyon, and then I heard the hoarse voice of a woman shouting at us. "Hi, there! Where are you going? Come back here!" With that, the three men stopped in their tracks, and I knew that the jig was up as far as secrecy was concerned. I took Duer's hand, and we kept on down the canyon. Now I could look back. Lula, Viola, and Ellie were marching back to their masters, and three of the women were coming down the canyon toward us. When they saw that two of us had ignored their command and were walking on, they commenced to shout again, and when we didn't pay any attention to them they broke into a trot, then we took to our heels. I didn't doubt but that we could outdistance them, for they were not built for speed. However, we would have to get to the ship far enough ahead of them to give us time to untie her before they overtook us. As we turned out of the mouth of the narrow canyon into the wide canyon of which it is a branch, we came on fairly level ground sloping gently in the direction we were going. Groups of splendid trees dotted the landscape, and off there somewhere in the near beyond was the ship and safety. Then, squarely across our path and a couple of 100 yards away, I saw 3 tharbans. 4. A new land. The sight of those 3 great beasts barring our way was just about as discouraging as anything I have ever encountered. Of course I had my pistol, but the rays don't always kill immediately any more than bullets do, and even if I should succeed in killing them the delay would permit the women to overtake us. I could hear them shouting, and I was afraid their voices might reach one of the hunting parties, so, all in all, I was in a tough spot. Fortunately, they hadn't come out of the narrow canyon yet, and I thought I saw a possible chance of eluding them and the tharbans. We were close to a group of trees the dense foliage of which would form an excellent hiding place, so I hoisted Duer to a lower branch and swung up after her. Climbing well up, we waited. Through the foliage we could look out, though I doubted that anyone could see us. The 3 tharbans had witnessed our ruse and were coming toward the tree, but when the running warrior women hove into sight out of the mouth of the narrow canyon the beasts paid no more attention to us, but turned their attention to the women instead. The sight of the tharbans brought the women to a sudden stop. I saw them looking around for us, and then, as the tharbans advanced, they retreated into the narrow canyon. The 3 beasts followed them, and the moment that all were out of sight Duer and I dropped to the ground and continued on toward the ship. We could hear the roars and growls of the tharbans and the shouts of the women growing fainter in the distance as we almost ran in our eagerness to reach the Anotar. What had appeared a few moments before almost a catastrophe had really proved our salvation, for now we had no need to fear pursuit from the village. My only immediate concern now was the ship, and I can tell you that I breathed a sigh of relief when we came in sight of it and I saw that it was intact. 5 minutes later we were in the air, and the adventure of Hutamai was a thing of the past. Yet, how near it had come to meaning death for me and a life of slavery for Duer. If the warrior women had taken but an extra moment to make sure that I was dead, how very different the outcome would have been. I shall always think that fear of the ship, a thing so strange to them, caused them to hurry away. Duer says that they talked much about the ship on the way back to the village and that it was evident that they were troubled by it, not being quite sure that it was not some strange beast that might pursue them. We had much to talk about as I circled in search of game, that I might make another kill, for I had not eaten for 2 days, and Duer only a few mean scraps while she was the slave of Bund. Duer kept looking at me and touching me to make sure that I was alive, so certain had she been that the Samarians had killed me. I should not have lived long, Carson, if you hadn't come, she said. With you dead, I didn't care to live, certainly not in slavery. I was only waiting for an opportunity to destroy myself. I located a herd of antelope-like animals and made my kill much as I had the previous day, but this time Duer kept vigilant lookout while I attended to the butchering. Then we flew to the island where Lula and I had stopped while I transformed myself into a brunette. This time I reversed the operation, after we had cooked and eaten some of our meat. Once again we were happy and contented. Our recent troubles now seemed very remote, so quickly does the spirit of man rebound from depression and push black despair into the limbo of forgetfulness. Duer was much concerned about my wounds and insisted on bathing them herself. The only danger, of course, was from infection, and we had no means of disinfecting them. Naturally, there was much less danger than there would have been on Earth, where overpopulation and increased means of transportation have greatly spread and increased the numbers of malignant bacteria. Also, the longevity serum with which I had been inoculated by Tharnus shortly after my arrival upon Amta gave me considerable immunity. All in all, I was not much concerned, but Duer was like a hen with one chicken. She had finally given in to her natural inclinations, and, having admitted her love, she was lavishing on its object the devotion and solicitude which raise love to its purest and most divine heights. We were both of us pretty well done in by all that we had been through, and so we decided to remain at the island until the following day at least. I was quite sure that there were no men and no dangerous beasts there, and for the first time in many months we could utterly relax without concern about the safety of ourselves or that of the other. Those were the most perfect 24 hours I had ever spent. The next day we took off from our little island with real regret and flew south along the valley of the river of death down toward the ocean into which we knew it must empty. But what ocean? What lay beyond it? Where in all this vast world could we go? Perhaps we can find another little island somewhere, Duer suggested, and live there always, just you and I alone. I didn't have the heart to tell her that in a few months we'd probably be wanting to knife one another. I was really in a quandary. It was impossible that we return to Vapaja. I knew now definitely that Duer would rather die than be separated from me, and there was no question but that I should be executed the moment Mintep, her father, got his hands on me. My only reason for planning to take Duer back to Vapaja had been my sincere belief that, no matter what became of me, she would be happier there eventually and certainly much safer than roaming around this savage world with a man absolutely without a country. But now I knew differently. I knew that either of us would rather be dead than permanently separated from the other. We'll make a go of it some way, I told her, and if there's a spot on Amta where we can find peace and safety we'll locate it. We have 50 years before the Ainotar falls to pieces, said Duer, with a laugh. We had flown but a short time before I saw what appeared to be a large body of water dead ahead, and such it soon proved to be. We had come to the ocean at last. Let's go out over it and look for our island, said Duer. We'd better stock up with food and water first, I suggested. I had wrapped the remainder of our meat in the large, waxy leaves I had found growing on the little island, and was sure that it would keep for several days, but of course we didn't want to eat it raw, and as we couldn't cook it while flying, there was nothing to do but land and cook the meat. I also wanted to gather some fruits and nuts and a tuber that grows almost everywhere on Amta and is quite palatable and nutritious, palatable even when eaten raw. I found an open flat that extended back from the river of death for several miles. It was forest bordered on one side, and a little river ran through it down to the larger stream from mountains to the east. I made a landing near the forest in the hope that I would find such fruits and nuts as I desired, nor was I disappointed. After gathering them, I loaded some firewood into the rear cockpit and taxied over beside the small stream. Here we were in the open where we could see the surrounding country in all directions and therefore in no danger of being surprised by either man or beast. I built a fire and cooked our meat while Duer kept watch. I also filled the water tank with which I had equipped the ship at the time it was built. We now had food and water sufficient for several days, and filled with the spirit of exploration we took off and headed out to sea, passing over the great delta of the River of Death, a river that must rival the Amazon. From the first, Duer had been keenly interested in the navigation of the ship. I had explained the purpose and operation of the controls, but she had not actually flown the Ainota herself. Now I let her try it, for I knew that she must learn to fly against the possibility of our being in the air for long periods such as might be necessitated by a transoceanic flight. I would have to have sleep, and this would not be possible in the air unless Duer could fly the ship. Now, flying a ship in the air under ordinary weather conditions is not even so difficult as walking, so it required only a few minutes to establish her confidence and give her something of the feel of the ship. I knew that practice would give her smoothness, and I had her fly at an altitude that would permit me to come to the rescue if she got in any trouble. We flew all that night with Duer at the controls about a third of the time, and when morning broke I sighted land. As far as I could see to the east and west the boles and foliage of great trees rose thousands of feet to disappear in the inner cloud envelope which floats forever over the entire expanse of Amta, a second defense to the outer cloud envelope against the intense heat of the sun that would otherwise burn the surface of the planet to a crisp. "That aspect looks familiar," I said to Duer when she awoke. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I think it is Vapaja. We'll skirt the coast, and if I'm right we will see the natural harbor where the Sofal and the Sovon lay at anchor the day that you were kidnapped and Camlot and I were captured by the Klangan. I'm sure I shall recognize it." Duer said nothing. She was silent for a long time as we flew along the coast. Presently I saw the harbor. "There it is," I said. "This is Vapaja, Duer." "Vapaja," she breathed. "We are here, Duer. Do you want to stay?" She shook her head. "Not without you." I leaned toward her and kissed her. "Where then?" I asked. "Oh, let's just keep on going. One direction's as good as another." The ship, at the time, was flying perhaps a couple of points north of west, so I simply maintained that course. The world ahead of us was absolutely unknown, as far as we were concerned, and as this course would keep us away from the Antarctic regions and well into the northern part of the South Temperate Zone, it seemed as good a course to hold as any. In the opposite direction lay the stronghold of the Thourists, where we could hope to find only captivity and death. As the long day wore away, nothing but illimitable ocean stretched monotonously before us. The ship functioned beautifully. It could not function otherwise, since into its construction had gone the best that the finest scientific minds of Havatu could give. The design had been mine, as aircraft were absolutely undreamed of in Havatu prior to my coming, but the materials, the motor, the fuel were exclusively Amtorian. For strength, durability, and lightness the first would be impossible of duplication on Earth. The motor was a marvel of ingenuity, compactness, power, and durability combined with lightness of weight, the fuel I have already described. In design the ship was more or less of a composite of those with which I was familiar or had myself flown on Earth. It seated four, two abreast in an open front cockpit and two in a streamlined cabin aft. There were controls in both cockpits, and the ship could be flown from any of the four seats. As I have before stated, it was an amphibian. During the long day I varied the monotony by instructing Duer in landings and takeoffs, there being a gentle westerly breeze. We had to keep a sharp lookout at these times for the larger denizens of the sea, some of which might easily have wrecked the ship had their dispositions been as fearsome as their appearance. As night fell, the vast Amtorian scene was bathed in the soft, mysterious, nocturnal light that beneficent nature has vouchsafed a moonless planet. Seemingly as limitless as interstellar space, the endless sea rolled to the outer rim of our universe, glowing wanly. No land, no ship, no living thing impinged upon the awful serenity of the scene, only our silent plane and we two infinitesimal atoms wandering aimlessly through space. Duer moved a little closer to me. Companionship was good in this infinite loneliness. During the night the wind veered and blew from the south, and at dawn I saw cloud banks rolling in ahead of us. The air was much cooler. It was evident that we were getting the tail end of a south polar storm. I didn't like the looks of that fog. I had blind flying instruments on the instrument board, but, even so, who would care to fly blind in a world concerning the topography of which he knew nothing? Nor was I particularly keen to chance waiting the fog out on the surface of the sea. The chances are it would have been safe enough, but I had seen far too many leviathans cavorting about in the waters beneath us to incline me toward spending any more time on the surface of the water than was absolutely necessary. I determined to change our course and fly north ahead of the fog. It was then that Duer pointed ahead. "Isn't that land?" she asked. "It certainly has all the appearances of land," I said, after taking a long look. "Maybe it is our island," she suggested laughingly. "We'll go and have a look at it before the fog rolls over it. We can always beat that fog if it gets too thick." "Land will look pretty good again," said Duer. "Yes," I agreed. "We've been looking at an awful lot of water." As we approached the coastline we saw mountains in the distance and far to the northwest what appeared to be one of those giant tree forests such as cover almost the entire area of the island of Vipaja. "Oh, there's a city," exclaimed Duer. "So it is a seaport. Quite a good-sized city, too. I wonder what kind of people live there." Duer shook her head. "I don't know. There is a land northwest of Vipaja that is called Anlap. I have seen it on the map. It lies partially in Trouble and partially in Strabble. The maps show it as an island, a very large island, but of course nobody knows. Strabble has never been thoroughly explored." It seemed to me that none of Venus had ever been thoroughly explored, nor could I wonder. The most able men I had met here clung to the belief that it was a saucer-shaped world floating on a molten sea. They thought that its greatest circumference lay at what I knew to be the South Pole, and on their maps the equator was not even a dot. They never dreamed of the existence of another hemisphere. With maps based on such erroneous reasoning, everything was distorted, and because their maps were therefore useless, no navigator dared go far from familiar waters and seldom out of sight of land. As we approached the city I saw that it was walled and heavily fortified, and closer inspection revealed the fact that it was being beleaguered by a large force. The hum of Amtorian guns came faintly to our ears. We saw the defenders on the walls, and, beyond the walls, we saw the enemy long lines of men encircling the city, each lying behind his shield. These shields are composed of metal more or less impervious to both R-rays and T-rays. And their use must result in far more mobile attacking forces than could have been possible were the men facing earthly bullets. It practically amounted to each man carrying his own trench. The troops could be maneuvered almost anywhere on the field of battle while under fire, with a minimum of casualties. As we passed over the city, firing practically ceased on both sides. We could see thousands of faces upturned toward us, and I could imagine the wonder and amazement that the ship must have engendered in the minds of those thousands of soldiers and civilians, not one of whom could possibly have conceived the nature of this giant, bird-like thing speeding silently above them. As every portion of the ship, whether wood, metal, or fabric, had been sprayed with a solution of this ray-resisting substance, I felt quite safe in flying low above the contending forces, and so I spiraled downward and, circling, flew close above the city's wall. Then I leaned out and waved my hand. A great shout rose from the men within the city, but the attackers were silent for a moment, then a volley of shots were directed at us. The ship might have been coated with ray-resisting material, but Duer and I were not, and so I zoomed to a safer altitude and turned the ship's nose inland to reconnoiter farther. Beyond the lines of the infesting forces we flew over their main camp, beyond which a broad highway led toward the southwest, from which direction troops were marching toward the camp, and there were long trains of wagons drawn by huge, elephantine animals, and men mounted on strange beasts, and big T-ray guns, and all the other impedimenta of a great army on the march. Turning toward the north, I reconnoitered in search of information. I wanted to know something about this country and the disposition of its inhabitants. From what I had already seen, their dispositions seemed unequivocally warlike, but somewhere there might be a peaceful, hospitable city where strangers would be treated with consideration. What I was looking for was a single individual whom I might question without risking injury to Duer or myself, for to have made a landing among those fighting men would probably have been fatal, especially among comrades of the contingent that had fired on us. The attitude of the defenders of the city had been more friendly, but still I couldn't risk a landing there without knowing something about them, nor did it seem the part of wisdom to land in a beleaguered city that, from the number of its attackers, might be taken any day. Duer and I were looking for peace, not war. I covered a considerable area of territory without seeing a human being, but at last I discovered a lone man coming out of a canyon in the hills several miles north of the big camp I have mentioned. As I dropped toward him, he turned and looked up. He did not run, but stood his ground, and I saw him draw the pistol at his hip. "Don't fire," I called to him as I glided past. "We are friends." "What do you want?" he shouted back. I circled and flew back, landing a couple of 100 yards from him. "I am a stranger here," I shouted to him. "I want to ask for information." He approached the ship quite boldly, but he kept his weapon in readiness for any eventuality. I dropped down from the cockpit and went forward to meet him, raising my right hand to show that it held no weapon. He raised his left, he wasn't taking any chances, but the gesture signified a friendly attitude, or at least not a belligerent one. A half-smile touched his lips as I descended from the ship. "So you are a human being, after all," he said. "At first I didn't know but that you were a part of that thing, whatever it is. Where are you from? What do you want of me?" "We are strangers here," I told him. "We do not even know in what country we are. We want to know the disposition of the people here towards strangers, and if there is a city where we might be received hospitably." "This is the land of Anlap," he said, "and we are in the kingdom of Corva." "What city is that back by the sea?" "There was fighting going on there." "You saw fighting?" he demanded. "How was it going? Had the city fallen?" He seemed eager for news. "The city had not fallen," I said, "and the defenders seemed in good spirits." He breathed a sigh of relief. Suddenly his brow clouded. "How do I know you're not a Zani spy?" he demanded. I shrugged. "You don't," I said, "but I'm not. I don't even know what a Zani is." "No, you couldn't be," he said presently. "With that yellow hair of yours I don't know what you could be, certainly not of our race." "Well, how about answering some of my questions?" I inquired with a smile. He smiled in return. "That's right. You wanted to know the disposition of the people of Corva to strangers and the name of the city by the sea. Well, before the Zanis seized the government, you would have been treated well in any Corvan city. But now it is different. Sonara, the city you asked about, would welcome you. It has not yet fallen under the domination of the Zanis. They are trying to reduce it now, and if it capitulates, the last stronghold of freedom in Corva will have fallen." "You are from Sonara?" I asked. "Yes, at present. I had always lived in Amlot, the capital, until the Zanis came into power, then I couldn't go back, because I had been fighting them." "I just flew over a big camp south of here," I said. "Was that a Zani camp?" "Yes. I'd give anything to see it." "How many men have they?" "I don't know, but it's a large camp, and more soldiers and supplies are coming in from the southwest." "From Amlot," he said. "Oh, if I could but see that." "You can," I told him. "How?" he demanded. I pointed toward the ship. He looked just a little bit taken aback, but only for a second. "All right," he said. "You will not regret your kindness. May I ask your name?" "Mine is Tarmin." And mine is Carson. He looked at me curiously. What country are you from? I have never before seen an Amtorian with yellow hair. It is a long story, I said. Suffice it to say that I am not an Amtorian, I am from another world. We walked toward the ship together, he, in the meantime, having returned his pistol to its holster. When we reached it, he saw Duer for the first time. I could just note a faint expression of surprise, which he hid admirably. He was evidently a man of refinement. I introduced them, and then showed him how to enter the rear cockpit and fasten his life belt. Of course I couldn't see him when we took off, but he afterward told me that he believed his end had come. I flew him directly back to the Zani camp and along the highway toward Amlot. This is wonderful, he exclaimed time and again. I can see everything. I can even count the battalions and the guns and the wagons. Tell me when you've seen enough, I said. I think I've seen all that's necessary. Poor Sonara. How can it withstand such a horde? And I may not even be able to get back and make my report. The city must be surrounded by troops by now. I just barely got out an axe ago. An axe is equivalent to 20 days of Amtorian time, or slightly over 22 days, 11 hours of Earth time. The city is entirely surrounded, I told him. I doubt that you could possibly pass through the lines even at night. Would you? He hesitated. Would I what? I asked, though I guessed what he wished to ask me. But no, he said, it would be too much to ask of a stranger. You would be risking your life and that of your companion. Is there any place large enough for me to land inside the walls of Sonara? I asked. He laughed. You guessed well, he said. How much space do you require? I told him. Yes, he said, there is a large field near the center of town where races were held. You could land there easily. A couple of more questions, I suggested. Certainly. Ask as many as you please. Have you sufficient influence with the military authorities to ensure our safety? I am, of course, thinking of my mate. I cannot risk harm befalling her. I give you the word of a nobleman that you will both be safe under my protection, he assured me. And that we shall be permitted to leave the city whenever we choose, and that our ship will not be molested or detained. Again you have my word for all that you have asked, he said, but still I think it is too much to ask of you, too much to permit you to do for a stranger. I turned to Duer. What is your answer, Duer? I asked. I think that I shall like Sonara, she said. I turned the ship's nose in the direction of the Corvan seaport. Sonara. Tarman was profuse in his gratitude, but not too profuse. I felt from the first that he was going to prove a likable fellow, and I know that Duer liked him, too. She ordinarily seldom enters into conversation with strangers. The old taboos of the John's daughter are not to be easily dispelled, but she talked with Tarman on the flight to Sonara, asking him many questions. You will like our people, he told her. Of course, now, under the strain of a long siege, conditions are not normal nor other people, but they will welcome you and treat you well. I shall take you both into my own home, where I know that my wife can make you comfortable even under the present conditions. As we passed over the Zani's lines they commenced to take pot shots at us, but I was flying too high for their fire to have been effective even against an unprotected ship. Tarman and I had discussed the matter of landing. I was a little fearful that the defenders might become frightened at this strange craft were it to attempt a landing in the city, especially as this time we would be approaching from enemy country. I suggested a plan which he thought might work out satisfactorily, so he wrote a note on a piece of paper which he had and tied it to one of the large nuts we had brought with us. In fact, he wrote several notes, tying each one to a different nut. Each note stated that he was in the onotta they saw flying above the city and asked the commander to have the racing field cleared so that we could make a safe landing. If the note were received and permission to land was granted, they were to send several men with flags to the windward end of the field with instructions to wave them until they saw us come in for a landing. This would accomplish two purposes: show us that we would not be fired on and also give me the direction of the wind at the field. I dropped the notes at intervals over the city, and then circled at a safe distance awaiting the outcome of our plan. I could see the field quite distinctly, and that there were quite a few people on it, far too many to make a landing safe. Anyway, there was nothing to do but wait for the signal. While we were waiting, Tarman pointed out places of interest in the city: parks, public buildings, barracks, the governor's palace. He said that the Zhong's nephew lived there now and ruled as Zhong, his uncle being a prisoner of the Zanis at Amlot. There were even rumors that the Zhong had been executed. It was that the defenders of Sonara feared as much as they feared the Zanis, because they didn't trust the Zhong's nephew and didn't want him as permanent Zhong. It seemed as though we'd circled over the city for an hour before we received any indication that our notes had been received. Then I saw soldiers clearing the people out of the racing field. That was a good omen. Then a dozen soldiers with flags went to one end of the field and commenced to wave them. At that I commenced to drop in a tight spiral. You see, I didn't want to go too near the city walls for fear of attracting the fire of the Zanis. Looking down, I saw people converging upon that field from all directions. The word that we were going to land must have spread like wildfire. They were coming in droves, blocking the avenues. I hoped that a sufficient detail of soldiers had been sent to keep them from swarming over the field and tearing us and the plane to pieces. I was so worried that I zoomed upward again and told Tarman to write another note asking for a large military guard to keep the people away from the ship. This he did, and then I dropped down again and tossed the note out on the field near a group of men that Tarman told me were officers. 5 minutes later we saw a whole battalion marched onto the field and posted around the edges. Then I came in for a landing. But weren't those people thrilled? They were absolutely breathless and silent until the ship rolled almost to a stop, then they burst into loud cheering. It certainly made me feel pretty good to realize that we were welcome somewhere in the world, for our situation had previously seemed utterly hopeless, realizing, as we did from past experience, that strangers are seldom welcome in any Amtorian city. My own experience on the occasion of my landing in Vapaja from my rocket ship had borne this out, for, though I was finally accepted, I had been a virtual prisoner in the palace of the Zhong for a long period of time. After Tarman alighted from the ship, I started to help Juer out, and as she stepped onto the wing in full view of the crowd the cheering stopped and there was a moment of breathless silence, then they burst forth again. It was a wonderful ovation they gave Juer. I think they hadn't realized that the third member of the party was a woman until she stepped into full view. The realization that it was a woman, coupled with her startling beauty, just simply took their breath away. You may be sure that I loved the people of Sonara from that moment. Several officers had approached the ship, and there were greetings and introductions, of course. I noted the deference they accorded Tarman, and I realized my good fortune in having placed a really important man under obligations to me. Just how important a personage he really was, I was not to learn until later. While we had been circling the field I had noticed a number of the huge animals, such as I had seen drawing the gun carriages and army wagons of the Zanis, standing at one side of the field behind the crowd. Several of the beasts were now brought onto the field and up to the ship, or as close as their drivers could urge them, for they were quite evidently afraid of this strange thing. I now got my first close view of a Ganta. The animal was larger than an African elephant and had legs very similar to those of that animal, but here the likeness ceased. The head was bull-like and armed with a stout horn about a foot long that grew out of the center of the forehead, the mouth was large, and the powerful jaws were armed with very large teeth. The coat, back of the shoulders, was short and a light tawny yellow marked with white splotches like a pinto horse, while covering the shoulders and short neck was a heavy dark mane. The tail was like that of a bull, 3 enormous horny toes covered the entire bottoms of the feet, forming hoofs. The driver of each animal sat on the manet above the shoulders, and behind him, on the creature's long, broad back was an open howdah capable of seating a dozen people. That, at least, describes the howdah of the first beast I noted closely. I saw later that there are many forms of howdahs, and in fact the one on the animal that was brought to carry Duer, Tarman, and me from the field was a very ornate howdah seating 4. Along the left side of each ganter a ladder was lashed, and when the drivers had coaxed their mounts as close as they could to the ship, each driver dropped to the ground and set his ladder up against his beast's side. Up these ladders the passengers climbed to the howdahs. I watched the whole procedure with interest, wondering how the driver was going to regain his seat if he lashed the ladder back to the ganter's side, or what he would do with the ladder if he used it to climb back onto the ganter. Well, I soon had my curiosity satisfied. Each driver lashed his ladder back in place against the ganter's side, then he walked around in front of the ganter and gave a command. Instantly the animal lowered its head until its nose almost touched the ground, which brought its horn into a horizontal position about 3 feet above the ground. The driver climbed onto the horn and gave another command, the ganter raised its head, and the driver stepped to its pole and from there to his seat above the shoulders. The howdahs of the other ganters were filled with officers and soldiers who acted as our escort from the field, some preceding and some following us off the field and along a broad avenue. As we passed, the people raised their hands in salute, the arms extended at an angle of about 4 to 5 degrees, their palms crossed. I noticed that they did this only as our ganter approached, and I soon realized that they were saluting Tarman, as he acknowledged the salutes by bowing to the right and left. So once again I had evidence that he was a man of importance. The people on the street wore the scant apparel that is common on Amta, where it is usually warm and sultry, and they also wore, according to what seems to be a universal custom, daggers and swords, the women the former, the men both. The soldiers among them also carried pistols slung in holsters at their hips. They were a very nice, clean-looking people with pleasant faces. The buildings facing the avenue were stuccoed, but of what materials they were built, I did not know. The architectural lines were simple but most effective, and notwithstanding the simpleness of the designs, the builders had achieved a diversity that gave pleasing contrasts. As we proceeded and turned into another avenue, the buildings became larger and more beautiful, but still the same simplicity of line was apparent. As we were approaching a rather large building, Tarman told me it was the palace of the governor, where the nephew of the Zhong lived and ruled in the absence of his uncle. We stopped in front of another large home directly across the street from the governor's palace. A guard of soldiers stood before an enormous gate built in the center of the front wall, which was flush with the sidewalk. They saluted Tarman, and swung the gate open. Our escort had previously moved back across the avenue, and now our driver guided his huge mount through the gateway along a wide corridor into an enormous courtyard where there were trees and flowers and fountains. This was the palace of Tarman. A small army of people poured from the building, whom, of course, I could not identify but whom I learned later were officers and officials of the palace, retainers, and slaves. They greeted Tarman with the utmost deference, but their manner indicated real affection. "Inform the Janjong that I have returned and am bringing guests to her apartments," Tarman directed one of the officers. Now Janjong means, literally, daughter of a Zhong, in other words, a princess. It is the official title of the daughter of a living Zhong, but it is often used through life as a courtesy title after a Zhong dies. A Tanzhong, son of a Zhong, is a prince. Tarman himself showed us our apartments, knowing that we would wish to freshen ourselves up before being presented to the Janjong. Women slaves took Duer in hand and a man slave showed me my bath and brought me fresh apparel. Our apartments, consisting of 3 rooms and 2 baths, were beautifully decorated and furnished. It must have been like heaven to Duer, who had known nothing of either beauty or comfort since she had been stolen from her father's palace over a year before. When we were ready, an officer came and conducted us to a small reception room on the same floor but at the opposite end of the palace. Here Tarman was awaiting us. He asked me how we should be introduced to the Janjong, and when I told him Juer's title I could see that he was both pleased and surprised. As for myself, I asked him to introduce me as Carson of Venus. Of course the word Venus meant nothing to him, as the planet is known to the inhabitants as Amta. We were then ushered into the presence of the Janjong. The formality of introductions on Amta are both simple and direct, there is no circumlocution. We were led into the presence of a most beautiful woman, who arose and smiled as we approached her. "This is my wife, Jahara, Janjong of Korva," announced Tarman, then he turned to Juer. "This is Juer, Janjong of Vapaja, wife of Carson of Venus, and, indicating me, this is Carson of Venus." It was all very simple. Of course Tarman didn't say wife, there is no marriage among any of the peoples I have known on Amta. A couple merely agree between themselves to live together, and they are ordinarily as faithful to one another as married couples on Earth are supposed to be. They may separate and take other mates if they choose, but they rarely do. Since the serum of longevity was discovered, many couples have lived together for 1,000 years in perfect harmony, possibly because the tie that bound them was not a fetter. The word that Tarman used instead of wife was Uljaganja, love woman. I like it. During our visit with Tarman and Jahara we learned many things concerning them and Korva. Following a disastrous war, in which the resources of the nation had been depleted, a strange cult had arisen, conceived and led by a common soldier named Mephis. He had usurped all the powers of government, seized Amlot, the capital, and reduced the principal cities of Korva with the exception of Sanara, to which many of the nobility had flocked with their loyal retainers. Mephis had imprisoned Jahara's father, Cord, hereditary Jong of Korva, because he would not accede to the demand of the Zanis and rule as a figurehead dominated by Mephis. Recently rumors had reached Sanara that Cord had been assassinated, that Mephis would offer the Jongship to some member of the royal family, that he would assume the title himself, but no one really knew anything about it. We also inferred, though no direct statement to that effect was made, that the Jong's nephew, Muso, acting Jong, was none too popular. What we didn't learn until much later was that Tarman, who was of royal blood, was directly in line for the throne after Muso, and that Muso was intensely jealous of Tarman's popularity with all classes of people. When we had picked Tarman up behind the enemy lines, he had been returning from a most hazardous assignment upon which Muso had sent him, possibly in the hope that he would never return. Food was served in the apartments of Jahara, and while we were eating, an officer of the Jong was announced. He brought a gracefully worded intimation that Muso would be glad to receive us immediately if Tarman and Jahara would bring us to the palace and present us. It was, of course, a command. We found Muso and his consort, Ilana, in the audience room of the palace surrounded by a considerable retinue. They were seated on impressive thrones, and it was evident that Muso was taking his Jongship very seriously. So great was his dignity that he did not condescend to smile, though he was courteous enough. The closest his equilibrium came to being upset was when his eyes fell on Juer. I could see that her beauty impressed him, but I was accustomed to that it usually startled people. He kept us in the audience chamber only long enough to conclude the formalities, then he led us into a smaller room. I saw the strange thing in which you fly as it circled above the city, he said. What do you call it? And what keeps it in the air? I told him that Juer had christened it an Ainotar, and then I explained briefly the principle of heavier-than-aircraft flight. Has it any practical value? He asked. In the world from which I come, airlines have been established that transport passengers, mail, and express between all the large cities and to every portion of the world. Civilized governments maintain great fleets of planes for military purposes. But how could an Ainotar be used for military purposes? He asked. For reconnaissance, for one thing, I told him. I flew Tarman over the enemy camp and along its line of communication. They can be used for destroying supply bases, for disabling batteries, even for direct attack upon enemy troops. How could your ship be used against the Zanis? He asked. By bombing their lines, their camp, and their supply depots and trains we might lower their morale. Of course, with but a single ship we could not accomplish much. I am not so sure of that, said Tarman. The psychological effect of this new engine of destruction might be far more effective than you imagine. I agree with Tarman, said Muso. I shall be glad to serve the Jong of Corva in any way, I said. Will you accept a commission under me? He asked. It will mean that you must swear allegiance to the Jong of Corva. Why not? I asked. I have no country on Amta, and the ruler and people of Sonara have accorded us courtesy and hospitality, and so I took the oath of allegiance to Corva and was commissioned a captain in the army of the Jong. Now, at last, I had a country, but I also had a boss. That part of it I didn't like so well, for, if I am nothing else, I am a rugged individualist. 6. A spy. The next few weeks were filled with interest and excitement. The Sanarans manufactured both RA and T-ray bombs as well as incendiary bombs, and I made almost daily flights over the enemy lines and camp. In the latter and along their line of communication I wrought the most havoc, but a single ship could not win a war. On several occasions I so demoralized their front line that successful sorties were made by the Sanarans during which prisoners were taken. From these we learned the repeated bombings had had their effect on the morale of the enemy and that an enormous reward had been offered by the Zani chief, Mephis, for the destruction of the ship or for my capture dead or alive. During these weeks we remained the guests of Tarman and Jahara, and were entertained frequently by Muso, the acting Jong, and his wife, Ilana. The latter was a quiet, self-effacing woman of high lineage but of no great beauty. Muso usually ignored her, and when he didn't, his manner toward her was often brusque and almost offensive, but she was uniformly sweet and unresentful. He was far more attentive to Duer than he was to his own wife, but that is oftentimes a natural reaction of a host in his endeavor to please a guest. While we did not admire it, we could understand it. The siege of Sonara was almost a stalemate. The city had enormous reserve supplies of synthetic foods, and its water supply was assured by artesian wells, nor was there any dearth of ammunition. The besiegers could not get into the city, and the besieged could not get out. So matters stood one day a month after my arrival in Sonara when Muso sent for me. He was pacing back and forth the width of a small audience chamber when I was ushered into his presence. He appeared nervous and ill at ease. I supposed at the time that he was worried over the seeming hopelessness of raising the siege, for it was of that he spoke first. Later he came to the point. I have a commission for you, Captain, he said. I want to get a message through to one of my secret agents in Amlot. With your ship you can easily cross the enemy lines and reach the vicinity of Amlot without the slightest danger of being captured. I can direct you to a spot where you can make contact with persons who can get you into the city. After that it will be up to you. This must be a secret expedition on your part, no one but you and I must know of it, not even Tarman, not even your wife. You will leave the first thing in the morning ostensibly on a bombing expedition, and you will not come back, at least not until you have fulfilled your mission. After that there will be no need for secrecy. If you succeed, I shall create you a noble, specifically an Ongvu, and when the war is over and peace restored I shall see that you receive lands and a palace. Now, the title Ongvu means, literally, exalted one and is hereditary in the collateral branches of the royal family, though occasionally conferred on members of the nobility for highly meritorious service to the Jong. It seemed to me at the time that the service I was commissioned to perform did not merit any such reward, but I gave the matter little thought. It would have been better had I done so. Muso stepped to a desk and took two thin leather containers, like envelopes, from a drawer. These contain the messages you are to deliver, he said. Tarman tells me that as you are from another world you probably do not read Amtorian, so you will write in your own language on the outside of each the names and location of those to whom you are to deliver these. He handed me a pen and one of the containers. This one you will deliver to Loder's at his farm 5 Klukob northwest of Amlot. I shall give you a map with the location marked on it. Loder's will see that you get into Amlot. There you will deliver this other message to a man named Spihan, from whom you will receive further instructions. From another drawer in the desk he took a map and spread it on the table. Here, he said, making a mark on the map a little northwest of Amlot, is a flat-topped hill that you will easily be able to locate from the air. It rises between two streams that join one another just southeast of it. In the fork of these two streams lies the farm of Loaders. You will not divulge to Loaders the purpose of your mission or the name of the man you are to meet in Amlot. But how am I to find Spihan? I asked. I am coming to that. He is posing as a Zani, and stands high in the councils of Memphis. His office is in the palace formerly occupied by my uncle, Cord, the Jong of Corva. You will have no difficulty in locating him. Now, of course you can't be safe in Amlot with that yellow hair of yours. It would arouse immediate suspicion. With black hair you will be safe enough if you do not talk too much, for, while they will know that you are not a member of the Zani party, that will arouse no suspicion, as not all of the citizens of Amlot are members of the party, even though they may be loyal to Memphis. How will they know that I'm not a member of the party? I asked. Zanis distinguish themselves by a peculiar form of haircut, he explained. They shave their heads except for a ridge of hair about 2 inches wide that runs from the forehead to the nape of the neck. I think you understand your instructions, do you not? I told him that I did. Then here are the envelopes and the map, and here, also, is a bottle of dye to color your hair after you leave Sonara. You have thought of everything, I said. I usually do, he remarked with a smile. Now is there anything you'd like to ask before you leave? Yes, I said. I should like to ask your permission to tell my wife that I shall be away for some time. I do not wish to cause her unnecessary worry. He shook his head. That is impossible, he said. No one must know. There are spies everywhere. If I find that she is unduly alarmed, I promise you that I shall reassure her. You will leave early tomorrow morning. I wish you luck. That seemed to close the audience, so I saluted and turned to leave. Before I reached the door he spoke again. You are sure you cannot read Emptorian? He asked. I thought the question a little strange and his tone a little too eager. Perhaps it was this, I don't know what else it could have been, that impelled me to reply as I did. If that is necessary, I said, perhaps you had better send someone else. I could fly him to Loders's farm and bring him back when his mission is completed. Oh, no, he hastened to assure me. It will not be necessary for you to read Emptorian. Then he dismissed me. Of course, having studied under Thanus in the palace of the Jong of Vapaja, I could read Emptorian quite as well as Muso himself. All that evening I felt like a traitor to Due, but I had sworn allegiance to Muso, and while I served him I must obey his orders. The next morning, as I kissed her goodbye, I suddenly had a premonition that it might be for the last time. I held her close, dreading to leave her, and she must have sensed in the tenseness of my body that something was amiss. She looked up at me questioningly. There is something wrong, Carson, she said. What is it? It is just that this morning I hate to leave you even more than usual. Then I kissed her and left. Following a plan of my own to deceive the enemy as to my possible destination, I flew east out over the ocean, turning north when I had passed beyond the range of their vision. Then I circled to the west far north of their camp and finally came to the ocean again west of Amlot. Flying back parallel with the coast and a few miles inland, I had no difficulty in locating the flat-topped hill that was my principal landmark. During the flight I had dyed my hair black and removed the insignia of my office and service from the scant trappings that, with my loincloth, constituted my apparel. Now I could pass as an ordinary citizen of Amlot, providing no one noticed the color of my eyes. I easily located the farm of Loaders in the fork of the rivers, and circled low looking for a suitable landing place. As I did so, a number of men working in the fields dropped their tools and ran toward the house, from which several other persons came to observe the ship. Evidently we aroused much excitement, and when I finally landed, several men came cautiously toward me with weapons ready for any eventuality. I climbed down from the cockpit and advanced to meet them, holding my hands above my head to assure them that my intentions were friendly. When we were within speaking distance, I hailed them. "Which of you is Loaders?" I asked. They all halted and looked at one big fellow who was in the lead. "I am Loaders," he replied. "Who are you? And what do you want of Loaders?" "I have a message for you," I said, holding out the leather envelope. He came forward rather hesitantly and took it from me. The others waited while he opened and read it. "All right," he said finally, "come to the house with me." "First I'd like to make my ship fast in a safe place," I told him. "Where would you suggest?" "It should be protected from the wind and be somewhere where it can be watched at all times." He looked at it rather dubiously for a moment, then he shook his head. "I haven't a building large enough to hold it," he said, "but you can put it between those two buildings over there. It will be protected from the wind there." I looked in the direction he indicated and saw two large buildings, probably barns, and saw that they would answer as well as anything he had to offer, so I taxied the ship between them, and with the help of Loaders and his fellows fastened it down securely. "Let no one ever touch it or go near it," I cautioned Loaders. "I think no one will wish to go near it," he said feelingly. It must have looked like some monster from another world to those simple Amtorian rustics. The ship tied down, the hands returned to the fields, and Loaders led me to the house, two women who had run out to enjoy the excitement accompanying us. The house, a long narrow building running east and west, had a veranda extending its full length on the south side and was windowless on the north, the side from which the prevailing warm winds came and the occasional hot blasts from the equatorial regions. Loaders led me into a large central room that was a combination living room, dining room, and kitchen. In addition to a huge fireplace, there was a large clay oven, the former necessitated during the winter months when the colder winds came from the Antarctic. At the door of the room, Loaders sent the women away, saying that he wished to speak with me alone. He seemed nervous and fearful, and when we were alone he drew me to a bench in a far corner of the room and sat close to me, whispering in my ear. "This is bad business," he said. "There are spies everywhere. Perhaps some of the men working for me were sent by Memphis. He has spies spying upon everyone and spies spying upon spies. Already rumors have come from Amlot of a strange thing that flies through the air, dropping death and fire upon the forces of Memphis. At once my workers will know that it is this thing that ye came in. They will be suspicious, they will talk. If there is a spy among them, he will get word to Memphis, and that will be the end of me. What am I to do?" "What did the message tell you to do?" I asked. "It told me to get you into Amlot, that was all." "Are you going to do it?" "I would do anything for Cord, my John," he said simply. "Yes, I shall do it, but I shall probably die for it." "Perhaps we can work out a plan," I suggested. "If there is a spy here or if your men talk too much, it will be as bad for me as for you. Is there any place near here where I could hide my ship, some place that it would be reasonably safe?" "If Memphis hears of it, it will not be safe here," said Loaders, and I appreciated the truth of his statement. He thought for a moment, then he shook his head. "The only place that I can think of is an island off the coast just south of us." "What sort of an island?" I asked. "Any clear, level land on it?" "Oh, yes, it is a very flat island. It is covered with grass. No one lives there. It is seldom that anyone goes there, never since the revolution." "How far offshore is it?" "It lies very close. I row to it in a few minutes." "You row to it? You have a boat?" "Yes, once a year we row over to pick the berries that grow there. The women make jam of them that lasts all the rest of the year." "Fine. I exclaimed. Now I have a plan that will remove all suspicion from you. Listen. For 10 minutes I talked, explaining every detail of my scheme. Occasionally Lotus slapped his knee and laughed. He was hugely pleased and relieved. Lotus was a big, simple, good-natured fellow. One couldn't help but like and trust him. I didn't want to get him in any trouble, on his own account, and, too, I knew that any trouble I got him into I would have to share. We decided to put my plan into execution immediately, so we left the house, and as we passed the women, Lotus spoke to me angrily. "Get off my farm," he cried. "I'll have nothing to do with you." We went at once to the ship and cast off the ropes, then I taxied it out toward the field where I had landed. Lotus followed on foot, and when we were within earshot of some of the men, he shouted at me loudly. "Get out of here! I'll have nothing to do with you. Don't ever let me see you on my farm again." The farm hands looked on in wide-eyed amazement, that grew wider-eyed as I took off. As I had done when I took off from Sonara, I flew in a direction opposite that I intended going, and when I was out of sight circled back toward the ocean. I found the island Lotus had described and landed easily. Some high bushes grew on the windward side, and behind these I made the ship fast. I worked on it until dark, and had it so securely fastened down that I didn't believe that anything short of a hurricane could blow it away. I had brought a little food with me from Sonara, and, after eating, I crawled into the cabin and settled myself for the night. It was very lonely out there with only the wind soughing through the bushes and the surf pounding on the shore of that unknown sea. But I slept and dreamed of Dua. I knew that she must be worrying about me already, and I felt like a dog to have treated her so. I hoped that Muso would soon tell her that I had but gone on a mission for him. At the worst, I hoped to be home by the second day. I awoke early and crossed the island to the shoreward side, and about half an hour later I saw a huge ganter approaching, drawing a wagon behind him. As he came nearer I recognized Lotus perched upon the animal's back. I waved to him, and he waved back. Leaving his conveyance near the shore, Lotus climbed down to a little cove, and presently I saw him pushing a crude boat into the water. Soon I was in it with him, and he was rowing back to the mainland. "How did our little scheme work?" I asked him. "Oh, fine," he said, with a broad grin. "I wouldn't tell them what you wanted me to do, but I told them that it was something wrong and that I was going to Amlot to tell the authorities about it. That satisfied them all, so if there was a spy among them I don't think he will give us any trouble. You are a very smart man to have thought of this plan." Once in the cove, we pulled the boat up onto a little ledge and climbed up to the waiting conveyance, a four-wheeled, box-like cart loaded with hay and vegetables. Lotus forked some of the hay to one side and told me to lie down in the depression he had made, then he forked the hay back on top of me. It was about 10 miles to Amlot, and of all the uncomfortable 10 miles I ever rode those took first prize. The hay was soft enough to lie on, but the seeds got in my ears and nose and mouth and under my harness and loincloth, and I almost suffocated beneath the pile of hay on top of me. The motion of the cart was eccentric, to say the least. It pitched and wobbled and bumped over a road that must have been new when longevity serum was invented, but never had a shot of it. The gait of the ganter was much faster than I had anticipated. He evidently had a long, swinging walk, and we must have made at least 6 miles an hour, which is somewhere between the speed of a horse's walk and trot. But at last we got to Amlot. I knew that, when we came to a stop and I heard men's voices questioning loaders. Finally I heard one say, "Oh, I know this farmer. He brings stuff into the city often. He's all right." They let us go on then, and I could tell by the sound of the wheels that we were rolling over a pavement. I was inside the walls of Amlot. I hoped the remainder of my mission would prove as readily fulfilled as this first part of it, and there was no reason to believe that it would not. If it did, I should be back with Dua by the following day. We must have driven a considerable distance into the city before we stopped again. There was a short wait during which I heard voices, but they were low, and I could not overhear what was being said. Then there was a creaking sound as of the hinges of a heavy gate, and immediately we moved forward a short distance and stopped again. Once more the hinges groaned, and then I heard Loders's voice telling me to come out. I didn't need a second invitation. Throwing the hay aside, I stood up. We were in the courtyard of a one-story house. A man was standing with Loders looking up at me. He didn't seem very glad to see me. "This is my brother, Horgen," said Loders, "and, Horgen, this is, say, what is your name, my friend?" "Wasn't it in the message I brought?" I asked, pretending surprise. "No, it wasn't." Perhaps it would be as well, I thought, if I didn't publicize my true name too widely. "Where I come from," I said, "I would be called Homo sapiens. Call me Homo," so Homo I became. "This is bad business," said Horgen. "If we are found out, the Zani guard will come and take us off to prison, and there we shall be tortured and killed. No, I do not like it." "But it is for the Jong," said Loders, as though that were ample reason for any sacrifice. "What did the Jong ever do for us?" demanded Horgen. "He is our Jong," said Loders simply. "Horgen, I am ashamed of you." "Well, let it pass. I will keep him this night, but tomorrow he must go on about his business. Come into the house now where I can hide you." "I do not like it. I do not like it at all. I am afraid. The Zani guard do terrible things to one whom they suspect." And so I went into the house of Horgen in Amlot, a most unwelcome guest. I sympathized with the two brothers, but I could do nothing about it. I was merely obeying the orders of Muso. 7. Zerka. Horgen gave me a little room on the court and told me to stay there so that no one would see me. Then he and Loders left me. It was not long before Loders returned to say that he was going to take his produce to market and then start home. He wanted to say goodbye to me and wish me luck. He was a fine, loyal fellow. The hours dragged heavily in that stuffy little room. At dusk Horgen brought me food and water. He tried to find out what I had come to Amlot for, but I evaded all his questions. He kept repeating that he would be glad to get rid of me, but at last he went away. After I had eaten I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't seem to want to come. I had just finally started to doze when I heard voices. They came from the adjoining room, and the partition was so thin that I could hear what was said. I recognized Horgen's voice, and there was the voice of another man. It was not Loders. "I tell you it is bad business," Horgen was saying. "Here is this man about whom I know nothing. If it is known that he is hiding here I shall get the blame, even though I don't know why he is hiding." "You are a fool to keep him," said the other. "What shall I do with him?" demanded Horgen. "Turn him over to the Zani guard." "But still they will say that I had been hiding him," groaned Horgen. "No, say that you don't know how he got into your house, that you had been away, and when you came back you found him hiding in one of your rooms. They will not harm you for that. They may even give you a reward." "Do you think so?" asked Horgen. "Certainly. A man who lives next to me informed on a neighbor, and they gave him a reward for that." "Is that so? It is worth thinking about. He may be a dangerous man. Maybe he has come to assassinate Memphis." "You could say that that was what he came for," encouraged the other. "They would give a very big reward for that, wouldn't they?" asked Horgen. "Yes, I should think a very big reward." There was silence for several minutes, then I heard a bench pushed back. "Where are you going?" demanded Horgen's visitor. "I am going to tell the Zanis," said Horgen. "I shall go with you," announced his companion. "Don't forget that the idea is mine. I should have half the reward. Maybe 2/3 of it." But he is my prisoner, insisted Horjan. It is I who am going to notify the Zani guard. You stay here. I rather guess not. If I told them what I know, they would arrest you both, and I'd get a great big reward. Oh, you wouldn't do that, cried Horjan. Well, I certainly shall if you keep on trying to rob me of the reward. Oh, I wouldn't rob you of it. I'll give you 10%. The other laughed. 10% nothing. I'll give you 10% and that's much more than you deserve, plotting against Mephis and Spihan and the rest of them. You can't put that over on me, shouted Horjan. Nobody'll believe you anyhow. Everybody knows what a liar you are. Hey, where are you going? Come back here. I'm the one that's going to tell them. I heard the sound of running feet, the slamming of a door, and then silence. That was my cue to get out of there, and I can tell you that I didn't waste any time acting on it. I didn't know how far they'd have to go to find a member of the Zani guard. There might be one at the next corner for all that I knew. I found my way out of the house in short order, and when I reached the avenue my two worthy friends were still in sight, quarreling as they ran. I turned and melted into the shadows of the night that fell in the opposite direction. There was no use running. I didn't even hurry, but sauntered along as though I were an old resident of Amlot going to call on my mother-in-law. The avenue I was in was dark and gloomy, but I could see a better lighted one ahead, so I made for that. I passed a few people, but no one paid any attention to me. Presently I found myself in an avenue of small shops. They were all open and lighted, and customers were coming and going. There were lots of soldiers on the street, and here I caught my first sight of a member of the Zani guard. There were 3 of them together, and they were swaggering down the sidewalk elbowing men, women, and children into the gutter. I felt a little nervous as I approached them, but they paid no attention to me. I had been doing a great deal of thinking since I had overheard the conversation between Horjan and his accomplice. I couldn't forget that the latter had linked Spihan's name with that of Mephis. The message that I carried in my pocket was addressed to Spihan. What could Muso be communicating secretly with a leader of the Zanis for? It didn't make sense, and it didn't sound good. It worried me. Then I recalled the inexplicable secrecy of my departure and the fact that Muso had warned me against telling loaders the name of the person I was bearing a message to. Why was he afraid to have that known? And why had he been so relieved when he assured himself that I could not read Emptorian? It was a puzzle that was commencing to clear itself up in my mind, or at least I was beginning to suspect something of the solution. Whether I were right or not, I might never know, or I might learn it tomorrow. That depended largely upon whether or not I delivered the message to Spihan. I was almost minded to try to get out of the city and back to my ship, then fly to Sonara and lay the whole matter before Tarman, whom I trusted. But my sometimes foolish sense of duty to a trust imposed in me soon put that idea out of my head. No, I would go on and carry out my orders, that was my duty as a soldier. As I proceeded along the avenue, the shops took on a more prosperous appearance, the trappings and jewels of the people on the street became richer. Gorgeously trapped ganters carried their loads of passengers to and fro or stopped before some shop while master or mistress entered to make a purchase. Before one brilliantly lighted building 20 or 30 huge ganters waited. When I came opposite the building, I looked in. It was a restaurant. The sight of the bright lights, the laughing people, the good food attracted me. The meager meal that Horjan had brought me had only served to whet my appetite. I entered the building, and as I did so I saw that it was apparently filled to capacity. I stood for a moment looking about for a vacant table, and was about to turn and walk out when an attendant came up to me and asked me if I wished to dine. I told him I did, and he led me to a small table for 2 where a woman was already seated. "Sit here," he said. It was a trifle embarrassing. "But this table is occupied," I said. "That is all right," said the woman. "You are welcome to sit here." There was really nothing else for me to do but thank her and take the vacant chair. "This is very generous of you," I said. "Not at all," she assured me. I had no idea, of course, that the attendant was bringing me to someone else's table. It was very presumptuous of him. She smiled. She had a very lovely smile. In fact, she was a very good-looking woman, and, like all the civilized women of Amta that I had seen, apparently quite young. She might have been 17 or 700 years old. That is what the serum of longevity does for them. "It was not so presumptuous as it might seem," she said, "at least not on the part of the attendant. I told him to fetch you." I must have looked my surprise. "Well, of course, that was very nice of you," was the only banality I could think of at the moment. "You see," she continued, "I saw you looking for a table. There was a vacant chair here. I was alone and lonely. You don't mind, do you?" "I'm delighted. You were not the only lonely person in Amlot. Have you ordered?" "No, the service here is execrable. They never have enough attendants, but the food is the best in town. But of course you have eaten here often, everyone eats here." I didn't know just what position to take. Perhaps it would be better to admit that I was a stranger rather than pretend I was not and then reveal the fact by some egregious error that I would be certain to make in conversation with any person familiar with Amlot and the manners and customs of its people. I saw that she was appraising me closely. Perhaps it would be more correct to say inventorying me, my harness, my other apparel, my eyes. I caught her quizzical gaze upon my eyes several times. I determined to admit that I was a stranger when our attention was attracted to a slight commotion across the room. A squad of Zani guards was questioning people at one of the tables. Their manner was officious and threatening. They acted like a bunch of gangsters. "What's all that about?" I asked my companion. "You don't know?" "It is one of the many things I don't know," I admitted. "About Amlot," she concluded for me. "They are looking for traitors and for Praetorians. It goes on constantly in Amlot nowadays. It is strange you have never noticed it. Here they come now." Sure enough, they were heading straight across the room for our table, and their leader seemed to have his eyes on me. I thought then that he was looking for me in particular. Later I learned that it is their custom to skip around a place, examining a few people in each. It is more for the moral effect on the citizens than for anything else. Of course they do make arrests, but that is largely a matter of the caprice of the leader unless a culprit has been pointed out by an informer. The leader barged right up to me and stuck his face almost into mine. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Give an account of yourself." "He is a friend of mine," said the woman across the table. "He is all right, Cordogan." The man looked at her, and then he wilted. "Of course, to Ganja," he cried apologetically, then he marched his men away and out of the restaurant. Perhaps it was very well for me, in addition to having your company, that this was the only vacant chair in the restaurant, although I really had nothing to fear. It is just disconcerting for a stranger. Then I guessed correctly. You are a stranger? Yes, to Ganja, I was about to explain when the Cordogan pounced on me. You have credentials though. Credentials? Why, no. Then it is very well for you that I was here. You would certainly have been on your way to prison now and probably shot tomorrow, unless you have friends here. Only one, I said. And may I ask who that one is? You. We both smiled. Tell me something about yourself, she said. It doesn't seem possible that there is such an innocent abroad in Amlot today. I just reached the city this afternoon, I explained. You see, I am a soldier of fortune. I heard there was fighting here, and I came looking for a commission. On which side? She asked. I shrugged. I know nothing about either side, I said. How did you get into the city without being arrested? She demanded. A company of soldiers, some workers, and a few farmers were coming through the gate. I just walked through with them. Nobody stopped me, nobody asked me any questions. Did I do wrong? She shook her head. Not if you could get away with it. Nothing is wrong that you can get away with. The crime is in getting caught. Tell me where you are from, if you don't mind. Why should I mind? I have nothing to conceal. I am from Vodaro. I remembered having seen a land mass called Vodaro on one of Tharnus's maps. It extended from the southern edge of the South Temperate Zone into the terra incognita of the Antarctic. Tharnus said that little was known of it. I hoped that nothing was known of it. Nothing less than I knew of it could be known. She nodded. I was sure you were from some far country, she said. You are very different from the men of Corva. Do all your people have grey eyes? Oh, yes, indeed, I assured her. All Vodaroans have grey eyes, or nearly all. It occurred to me that she might meet a Vodaroan someday who had black eyes. If she got to inquiring around right in this restaurant, she might find one. I didn't know, and I wasn't taking any chances. She seemed to be quite an alert person who liked to seek after knowledge. An attendant finally condescended to come and take our order, and after the dinner arrived I found that it was well worth waiting for. During the meal she explained many things about conditions in Amlot under the rule of the Zanis, but so adroit was she that I couldn't tell whether she was a file or a phobe. While we were in the midst of dinner, another detachment of the Zani guard entered. They went directly to a table next to us where a citizen who accompanied them pointed out one of the diners. That is he cried accusingly. His great-grandmother was nursed by an Atean woman. The accused rose and paled. Miss Tal, cried the Cordogan in charge of the detachment, and struck the accused man heavily in the face, knocking him down. Then the others jumped on him and kicked and beat him. Finally they dragged him away, more dead than alive. A mistal is a rodent about the size of a cat. The word is often used as a term of opprobrium, as one might say pig. Now what was all that about? I asked my companion. Why should a man be beaten to death because his great-grandmother nursed at the breast of an Atean woman? The milk and therefore the blood of an Atean entered the veins of an ancestor, thereby contaminating the pure blood of the super race of Corva, she explained. But what is wrong with the blood of an Atean? I asked. Are Taurians diseased? It is really rather difficult to explain, she said. If I were you I should just accept it as fact while in Amlot and not discuss it. I realized that that was excellent advice. From what I had seen in Amlot I was convinced that the less one discussed anything the better off he would be and the longer he would live. You haven't told me your name, said the Taganger. Mine is Zerka. I couldn't safely give her my own name, and I didn't dare use Homo any longer because I was sure I had been reported by Horjan and his good friend, so I had to think of another name quickly. Vodo, I said quickly, thinking that Vodo of Vodaro sounded almost colossal. And in your own country you must be a very important man, she said. I could see she was trying to pump me, and I saw no use in saying I was a streetcar conductor or an author or anything like that. They wouldn't sound important enough, and, anyway, as long as I was launched on a career of deception I might as well make a good job of it. I am the Tanjong of Vodaro, I told her, but please don't tell anyone. I'm traveling incognito. A Tanjong is the son of a ruling Jong, a prince. But how in the world did your government ever permit you to travel alone like this? Why, you might be killed. From what I have seen of Amlot I can readily agree with you, I said, laughing. As a matter of fact, I ran away. I got tired of all the pomp and ceremony of the court. I wanted to live my life as a man. That is very interesting, she said. If you want to take service here, perhaps I can help you. I am not without influence. Come and see me tomorrow. The driver of any public ganter knows where my palace is. Now I must be going. This has been quite an adventure. You have kept me from utter boredom. I noticed that she said utter. I walked to the door with her, where two warriors saluted her and followed us to the curb, one of them summoning the driver of a ganter, her private conveyance. Where do you stop? She asked me, as she waited for her ganter. I haven't stopped yet, I told her. You know I am a stranger here. Can you suggest a good place? Yes, come with me, I'll take you there. The ornate howdah on the broad back of her ganter seated four in the front compartment, 2 and 2, facing one another. Behind this was another seat where the two armed guards rode. As the great beast strode majestically along the avenue, I watched with interest the night life of this Amtorian city. Previously I had been in Kuad, the tree city of Vapaja, in the Thorist city of Kapta, in Korma, the city of the dead, and in lovely Havatu. The latter and this city of Amlot were, of all of them, the only cities in the true sense of the word, and while Amlot could not compare with Havatu, it was yet a city of life and activity. Though the hour was late, this main avenue was thronged with people. Lines of gaily caparisoned ganters moved in both directions carrying their loads of passengers gay and laughing, grave and serious. Everywhere the Zani guardsmen were in evidence, their strange headdress distinguishing them from all others, a 2-inch ridge of hair from forehead to nape. Their apparel was distinctive too, because of its ornateness. Shops and restaurants, gambling houses and theatres, brilliantly lighted, lined the avenue. Amlot did not seem like a city at war. I mentioned this to Zerka. It is our way of keeping up the morale of the people, she explained. As a matter of fact, the last war, which brought on the revolution, left us disillusioned, bitter, and impoverished. We were compelled to give up our entire navy and merchant marine. There was little life and less laughter on the avenues of Amlot. Then, by decree of Cord, the Jong, every public place was required to reopen and the people, in some instances, actually driven into the streets to patronize them. The effect was electrical, and after the revolution the Zanis encouraged the practice. It has been most helpful in maintaining the spirit of the people. Well, here we are at the traveler's house. Come and see me tomorrow. I thanked her for her courtesy to me and for the pleasant evening she had given me. The driver had placed the ladder against the ganter's side, and I was about to descend, when she laid a hand on my arm. If you are questioned, she said, tell them what you told me, and if they do not believe you, or you get in any trouble, refer them to me. Tell them I have given you permission to do so. Here, take this and wear it, and she slipped a ring from one of her fingers and handed it to me. It will substantiate your claim to my friendship. And now, one other thing. I would not mention again that you are a Tanjong. Royalty is not so popular in Amlot as it once was. Why, is immaterial. A very great Jong came here recently in search of an only daughter who had been kidnapped. He is still imprisoned in the Gap Kumrov if he is yet alive. A very great Jong whose only daughter had been kidnapped. Could it be possible? What great Jong is that? I asked. Her eyes narrowed a little as she replied, it is not well to be too inquisitive in Amlot during these times. I am sorry, I said, then I descended to the sidewalk, and her great ganter moved off down the avenue. 8. Muso's message. The traveller's house, or hotel, to which Zerka had brought me was really quite magnificent, indicating that Amlot had been a city of considerable wealth and importance in this part of Amta. The lobby served the same purpose that a lobby in an earthly hotel does. The desk was a large, circular booth in the center. There were benches, chairs, divans, flowers, small shops opened from it. I felt almost at home. The lobby was crowded. The ubiquitous Zani guard was well represented. As I stepped to the desk, two of them followed me and listened while the clerk questioned me, asking my name and address. Where are your credentials? Barked one of the Zanis. I have none, I replied. I am a stranger from Vodaro, seeking military service here. What? No credentials, you mistell. You are probably a dog of a spy from Sonara. He bellowed so loud that the attention of everyone in the lobby was attracted, and all about us there fell a silence that seemed to me the silence of terror. This is what you need, he yelled, and struck at me. I am afraid I lost my temper, and I know I did a very foolish thing. I parried his blow and struck him heavily in the face, so heavily that he sprawled backward upon the floor fully 10 feet from me. Then his companion came for me with drawn sword. You had better be sure what you are doing, I said, and held out the ring Zerka had given me so that he could see it. He took one look at it and dropped the point of his weapon. Why didn't you say so? He asked, and his tone was very different from what that of his fellow had been. By this time the latter had staggered to his feet and was trying to draw his sword. He was quite groggy. Wait, his companion cautioned him, and went and whispered in his ear, whereupon they both turned and left the lobby like a couple of whipped dogs. After that the clerk was the personification of courtesy. He inquired about my luggage, which I told him would arrive later. Then he called a strapping porter who had a chair-like contraption strapped to his back. The fellow came and knelt before me and I took my seat in the chair, for it was obvious that that was what was expected of me. Then he stood up, took a key from the clerk and ran up 3 flights of stairs with me, a human elevator, and the only sort of elevator known to Amlot. The fellow was a veritable composite of Hercules and Mercury. I tried to tip him after he had set me down in my room, but he couldn't understand my good intentions. He thought I was trying to bribe him to do something that he shouldn't do. I am sure he reported me as a suspicious character after he returned to the desk. My room was large and well furnished, a bath opened from it. A balcony in front overlooked the city out to the ocean, and I went out there and stood for a long time thinking over all that had occurred to me, but mostly thinking of Duer. I also thought much on my strange encounter with the Taganja Zerka. I couldn't quite convince myself that her interest in me was wholly friendly, yet I really had no reason to doubt it, except, perhaps, that she seemed a woman of mystery. It is possible that I doubted her sincerity because of my own deceitfulness, yet what else could I have done? I was in an enemy city, where, if the truth about me were even suspected, I should have received short shrift. As I could not tell the truth, I had to lie, and while I was lying, I might as well make a good job of it, I reasoned. I was sure that I had completely deceived her. Had she also deceived me? I knew the city was full of spies. What better way to entice a stranger into unwary admissions than through a beautiful woman? It is as old as espionage itself. The possibility that Duer's father, Mintep, might be a prisoner here gave me the most concern and resolved me to remain until I had definitely established the truth or falsity of my suspicions. The reference to Spihan, made by Horgen's companion, that linked closely with the leader of Zainism, the name of the man to whom I bore a message from Muso, was also good for considerable conjecture. I was frankly apprehensive that all was not as it should be. There was a way to discover, perhaps. I took the leather envelope containing Muso's message from my pocket pouch, broke the seals, and opened it. This is what I read. Muso, the Jong. Addresses Spihan at Amlot. May success attend your ventures and old age never overtake you. Muso dispatches this message to Spihan by Carson of Venus, who cannot read Amtorian. If Sonara were to fall into the hands of Memphis, this unfortunate civil war would be ended. That would be well if Muso were to be Jong of Corva after the fall of Sonara. If Memphis wishes all this to happen, let 3 blue rockets be shot into the air before the main gate of Sonara on 3 successive nights. On the 4th night let a strong force approach the main gate secretly, with stronger reserves held nearby. Then Muso will cause the main gates to be thrown open for the purpose of permitting a sortie. But there will be no sortie. The troops of Memphis may then enter the city in force. Muso will surrender, and the bloodshed may cease. Muso will make a good Jong, conferring always with Memphis. The Zanis shall be rewarded. It would be regrettable, but best, if Carson of Venus were destroyed in Amlot. May success be yours. Muso. Jong. I turned a little cold at the thought of how near I had been to delivering that message without reading it. I hadn't realized that I had been carrying my death warrant around on me as innocently as a babe in the woods. I looked around for some means of destroying it, and found a fireplace in one corner of the room. That would answer the purpose nicely. I walked to it, carrying the document, and, taking my little pocket firemaker from my pouch, was about to set fire to it when something caused me to hesitate. Here was a valuable document, a document that might mean much to Tarman and to Corva if it were properly utilized. I felt that it should not be destroyed, yet I didn't like the idea of carrying it around with me. If I could but find a hiding place. But where? No place in this room would answer if I were even slightly under suspicion, and I knew that I already was. I was positive that the moment I left the room it would be thoroughly searched. I put the message back in its leather container and went to bed. Tomorrow I would have to solve this problem, tonight I was too tired. I slept very soundly. I doubt that I moved all night. I awoke about the second hour, which would be about 6:40 a.m. Earth time. The Amtorian day is 26 hours, 56 minutes, 4 seconds of Earth time. Here it is divided into 36 hours of 40 minutes each, the hours being numbered from 1 to 36. The first hour corresponds roughly with mean sunrise, and is about 6 a.m. Earth time. As I rolled over and stretched for a moment before arising, I felt quite content with myself. I was to call on Zerka this very morning with the possibility of obtaining service of some nature with the Zanis that might make it possible for me to ascertain if Mintep were really in Amlot. I had read Muso's message to Spihan, so that was no longer a menace to me. My only real problem now was to find a suitable hiding place for it, but I have so much confidence in myself that I did not apprehend any great difficulty in doing so. Stepping out of bed, I walked to the balcony for a breath of fresh air and a look at the city by daylight. I saw that the traveller's house stood much closer to the waterfront than I had imagined. There was a beautiful landlocked harbour lying almost at my feet. Innumerable small boats lay at anchor or were moored to quays. They were all that the enemy had left to the conquered nation. A new day was before me. What would it bring forth? Well, I would bathe, dress, have breakfast, and see. As I crossed to the bath, I saw my apparel lying in disorder on the floor. I knew that I had not left it thus, and immediately I became apprehensive. My first thought, naturally, was of the message, and so the first thing that I examined was my pocket pouch. The message was gone. I went to the door. It was still locked as I had left it the night before. I immediately thought of the 2 Zani guardsmen with whom I had had an altercation in the lobby. They would have their revenge now. I wondered when I would be arrested. Well, the worst they could do would be to take me before Spihan, unless he had already issued orders for my destruction. If I were not immediately arrested, I must try to escape from the city. I could not serve Mintep now by remaining. My only hope was to reach Sonara and warn Tarman. I performed my toilette rather perfunctorily and without interest, then I descended to the lobby. It was almost empty. The clerk on duty spoke to me quite civilly, for a hotel clerk. No one else paid any attention to me as I found the dining room and ordered my breakfast. I had made up my mind that I was going to see Zerka. Maybe she could and would help me to escape from the city. I would give her a good reason for my wishing to do so. After finishing my breakfast, I returned to the lobby. The place was taking on an air of greater activity. Several members of the Zani guard were loitering near the desk. I determined to bluff the whole thing through, so I walked boldly toward them and made some inquiry at the desk. As I turned away, I saw 2 more of the guardsmen enter the lobby from the avenue. They were coming directly toward me, and I at once recognized them as the 2 with whom I had had the encounter the preceding night. This, I thought, is the end. As they neared me, both of them recognized me, but they passed on by me, and as they did so, both saluted me. After that I went out into the street and window shopped to kill time, then about the 8th hour, 10:40 a.m. ET. I found a public ganter and directed the driver to take me to the palace of Tiganja Zerka. A moment later I was in the cab of my amazing taxi and lumbering along a broad avenue that paralleled the ocean. Shortly after we left the business portion of the city we commenced to pass magnificent private palaces set in beautiful grounds. Finally we stopped in front of a massive gate set in a wall that surrounded the grounds of one of these splendid residences. My driver shouted, and a warrior opened a small gate and came out. He looked up at me questioningly. "What do you want?" he asked. "I have come at the invitation of the Tiganja Zerka," I said. "What is your name, please?" he asked. "Vodo," I replied. I almost said homo. "The Tiganja is expecting you," said the warrior as he threw open the gates. The palace was a beautiful structure of white marble, or what looked like white marble to me. It was built on 3 sides of a large and beautiful garden, the 4th side being open to the ocean, down to the shore of which the flowers, shrubbery, and lawn ran. But just then I was not so much interested in scenic beauty as I was in saving my neck. After a short wait, I was ushered into the presence of Zerka. Her reception room was almost a throne room, and she was sitting in a large chair on a raised dais which certainly carried the suggestion of sovereignty. She greeted me cordially and invited me to sit on cushions at her feet. "You look quite rested this morning," she observed. "I hope you had a good night." "Very," I assured her. "Any adventure after I left you? You got along all right in the hotel?" I had a feeling she was pumping me. I don't know why I should have, unless it was my guilty conscience, but I did. "Well, I had a little altercation with a couple of the Zani guardsmen," I admitted, "and I lost my temper and knocked one of them down, very foolishly." "Yes, that was foolish. Don't do such a thing again, no matter what the provocation. How did you get out of it?" "I showed your ring. After that they left me alone. I saw them again this morning, and they saluted me." "And that was all that happened to you?" she persisted. "All of any consequence." She looked at me for a long minute without speaking. She seemed either to be weighing something in her mind or trying to fathom my thoughts. Finally she spoke again. "I have sent for a man to whom I am going to entrust your future. You may trust him implicitly. Do you understand, implicitly?" "Thank you," I said. "I don't know why you are doing these things for me, but I want you to know that I appreciate your kindness to a friendless stranger and that if I can serve you at any time, well, you know you have only to command me." "Oh, it is nothing," she assured me. "You saved me from a very bad evening with myself, and I am really doing very little in return." Just then a servant opened the door and announced, "Multu Mephis." Mantar. A tall man in the trappings and with the headdress of a Zani guardsman entered the room. He came to the foot of the dais, saluted and said, "Multu Mephis." "Multu Mephis," replied Zerka. "I am glad to see you, Mantar. This is Vodo, and to me, this is Mantar." "Multu Mephis." "I am glad to know you, Vodo," said Mantar. "And I am glad to know you, Mantar," I replied. A questioning frown clouded Mantar's brow, and he glanced at Zerka. She smiled. "Vodo is an utter stranger here," she said. "He does not yet understand our customs. It is you who will have to inform him." Mantar looked relieved. "I shall start at once," he said. "You will forgive me, then, Vodo, if I correct you often?" "Certainly. I shall probably need it." To begin with, it is obligatory upon all loyal citizens to preface every greeting and introduction with the words Multu Mephis. Please, never omit them. Never criticize the government or any official or any member of the Zani party. Never fail to salute and cry multu mephis whenever you see and hear others doing it. In fact, it will be well if you always do what you see everyone else doing, even though you may not understand. I shall certainly follow your advice, I told him, but what my mental reservations might be I wisely kept to myself, as he probably did also. Now, Mantar, said Zerka, this ambitious young man is from far Vodaro, and he wishes to take service as a soldier of Amlot. Will you see what you can do for him? And now you must both be going, as I have many things to attend to. I shall expect you to call and report to me occasionally, Vodo. 9. I become a Zani. Mantar took me immediately to the palace formerly occupied by the Jong, Cord, and now by Mephis and his lieutenants. We shall go directly to Spihan, he said. No use wasting time on underlings. To Spihan. To the man whom Muso had advised to destroy me. I felt positive that the message must already be in his hands, as it must have been stolen by Zani spies who would have delivered it to him immediately, was going to my doom. Why do we go to Spihan? I asked. Because he is head of the Zani Guard, which also includes our secret police. Zerka suggested that I find you a berth in the guard. You are fortunate indeed to have such a friend as the Taganja Zerka, otherwise, if you had been given service at all, it would have been at the front, which is not so good since Muso enlisted the services of this fellow called Carson of Venus with his diabolical contrivance that flies through the air and rains bombs on everyone. Flies through the air? I asked, in simulated surprise. Is there really such a thing? What can it be? We really don't know much about it, Mantar admitted. Of course everyone at the front has seen it, and we learned a little from some prisoners we took who were members of a Sanaran party making a sortie against our first line. They told us the name of the fellow who flies it and what little they knew of him and of the thing he calls an Ainotar, but that really was not much. Yes, you will be fortunate if you get into the guard. If you are an officer, it is something of a sinecure, but you'll have to watch your step. You must hate everything we Zanis hate and applaud everything that we applaud, and under no circumstances must you ever even look critical of anything that is Zani. To demonstrate what I mean, we were listening to a speech by our beloved Mephis one evening, when a bright light shining in his eyes unexpectedly caused one of my fellow officers to knit his brows and half close his eyes in what appeared to be a frown of disapproval. He was taken out and shot. I shall be very careful, I assured him, and you may believe me that I meant it. The palace of the former Jong was, indeed, a magnificent structure, but I'm afraid I didn't fully appreciate it as I walked through its corridors toward the office of Spihan. My mind was on other things. We arrived at last at a waiting room just outside the office of the great man, and there we waited for about half an hour before we were summoned into the presence. Men were coming and going to and from the waiting room in a constant stream. It was a very busy place. Most of them wore the Zani uniform and sported the Zani coiffure, and as they came and went the air was filled with multu mephises and Zani salutes. At last we were ushered into the presence of Spihan. Like nearly all civilized Amtorians, he was a handsome man, but his mouth was a shade too cruel and his eyes a little too shifty for perfection. Mantar and I each said multu mephis and saluted. Spihan said multu mephis. Greetings, Mantar. What brings you here? He barked the words like a human terrier. Multu mephis. This is Vodo, announced Mantar. I bring him to you at the suggestion of the Taganja Zerka, his good friend. She recommends him for a commission in the guard. But he is not even a Zani, expostulated Spihan. He is not even from Anlap, said Mantar, but he wishes to be a Zani and serve our beloved Mephis. From what country do you come? Demanded Spihan. From Vodaro, I replied. Have you any Atean blood in your veins? Had I should have been killed in Vodaro, I cried. And why? He asked. And why, may I ask, Spihan, do you kill Atorians? I demanded. Naturally, Because they have large ears, he replied. We must keep the blood of Corvins pure. You have answered your own question, Spihan, I told him. We Voderoans are very proud of our pure blood, so we, too, kill the Atorians because they have large ears. Excellent, he exclaimed. Will you swear to love, honor, and obey our beloved Mephis, give your life for him, if necessary, and hold him and the Zani party above all else? I swear, I said, but I had my fingers crossed. Then we all saluted and said, Multu Mephis. You are now a Zani, he announced. He saluted me, and said, Multu Mephis. Multu Mephis, I said, and saluted him. I appoint you a Tokordogan, said Spihan, saluting, Multu Mephis. Multu Mephis, I replied, and saluted. A Tokordogan is somewhat similar to a lieutenant. A Kordogan is comparable to a sergeant, and as the prefix to means either high or over, my title might be translated as over-sergeant. You will be responsible for Vodo's training, Spihan told Mantar. Then we all Multu Mephized and saluted. I breathed a sigh of relief as I quitted the office of Spihan. Evidently he had not received the message as yet. I still had a little lease on life. Mantar now took me to the officers' quarters adjoining the barracks of the Zani Guard, which are situated close to the palace, and here a barber gave me an approved Zani haircut, after which I went with Mantar to be outfitted with the regulation uniform and weapons of a Tokordogan of the Zani Guard. On the way back from the outfitters I heard a great commotion ahead of us on the broad avenue along which we were walking. People lining the curbs were shouting something that I could not understand at first, but presently recognized as the incessant chant of the Zanis, Multu Mephis. As the sound approached I saw that the shouts were being directed at a procession of giant Gantus. Our beloved Mephis comes this way, said Mantar. When he approaches, stand at salute and shout Multu Mephis as loud as you can until he has passed. Presently I saw men standing on their heads in the street and along the curbs, and each of them was shouting Multu Mephis at the top of his lungs. Only the women and the members of the Zani Guard did not stand on their heads, but everybody shouted, and everybody saluted who was not using his hands to keep him from falling down. They commenced when the first elephant came within a few yards of where they stood, and continued until the last elephant had passed them by the same distance. They all seemed absolutely devoid of any sense of humor. When the procession came abreast of me I saw such ornately housed and trapped Gantus as I had never before seen. In the gilded howdah of one of them sat a small, insignificant-looking man in the uniform of a Zani Kordogan. It was Mephis. He looked actually frightened, and his eyes were constantly darting from side to side, warily. I guessed, what I learned later, that he was in mortal fear of assassination, and with good reason. After Mephis had passed I expressed a wish to Mantar to see something of the city. I told him that I would especially like to go down to the waterfront and look at the boats there. Immediately he was suspicious. I have never seen such suspicious people. Why do you want to go down to the waterfront? He asked. We Voderoans depend much on the sea for most of our food, therefore we are all familiar with boats and fond of them. I am naturally interested in seeing the design of the small boats of Anlap. As a matter of fact, I should like much to own one. I like to sail and fish. My explanations seemed to satisfy him, and he suggested that we hail a passing Ganta and ride down to the quay, which we did. I saw innumerable boats, most of which had evidently not been in use for some considerable time. Mantar explained that they probably belonged to men who were serving at the front. Do you suppose I could buy or rent one of them? I asked. You do not have to buy or rent anything, he said. You are now a member of the Zani Guard and can take anything you please from anyone who is not a member of the Guard. That was an excellent convention for the Zani Guardsmen. Having seen and learned what I had come to the waterfront for, I was ready to return into the city and commence my real training under Mantar. This lasted in an intensive form for about a week, during which time I did not visit Zerka nor receive any call from Spihan. Could it be that the message had not come into his hands? I could scarcely believe it. Perhaps, I thought, he is not going to accept Muso's offer and is not, therefore, interested in destroying me. But that line of reasoning was not wholly satisfactory. Knowing how suspicious they were and vindictive, I could not believe that Spihan would permit me to live or wear the uniform of a Zani guardsman a day after he discovered how I had lied to him. I was compelled to consider the matter only as a wholly baffling mystery. I cannot say that I enjoyed the companionship of my fellow officers, with the exception of Mantar. He was a gentleman. Most of the others were surly boors, an aggregation of ignorant thugs, bums, and gangsters. The men under us were of the same types. All seemed suspicious of one another, and I think especially of Mantar and me. They resented the fact that we were cultured, and the very fact that we were cultured seemed to feed their suspicions of us, and because they felt their inferiority, they hated us, too. Because of this atmosphere of suspicion, it was difficult for me to learn anything about the one thing that kept me from escaping from Amlot. At once I referred to my belief that Mintep might be a prisoner in the city. I felt that I could easily escape by commandeering a small boat and sailing along the coast until I came to the island where my ship was hidden, but first I must assure myself of the truth or falsity of my suspicion. All that I might learn was what I overheard by accident. I could not ask direct questions nor reveal undue interest in any political or other controversial matter. As a result, my nerves were under constant strain, so watchful must I be of every word or act or even facial expression or tone of voice. But it was like that with everyone else, I think, even with Spihan and perhaps with Mephis himself, for every man knew that a spy or an informer was watching to pounce upon him at his first misstep. The result was not conducive to garrulity. Conversation, as such, did not exist except between occasional intimates, and even then I doubt that men dared speak what was in their hearts. 10 days had passed, and I was no nearer my goal than on the day I arrived in Amlot. I was worried and was grieving over Duer. What must she think? Had Muso told her? Was she well? These unanswerable questions nearly drove me mad. They almost convinced me that I should abandon my self-imposed commission and return to Sonara, but when I thought of the happiness it would bring to Duer were she to be reunited with her father, or her grief were she to know that he might be a prisoner in Amlot and in constant danger of being destroyed, I could only remain and do what I considered my duty. I was in such a mood when I received an invitation from Zerka to visit her. It was a welcome relief, and I went with pleasure. We greeted each other with the usual Maltu Mephis, which, for some reason, seemed wholly out of place and incongruous between us. I always had a feeling that Zerka was hiding a laugh about something, and especially so when we went through the silly flubdub of Zani ritual. Hers was a most engaging personality that seemed to me to be wholly out of harmony with the stupidities of Zainism. "My," she exclaimed with a little laugh, "what a handsome Zani guardsman we make. With this haircut?" I demanded, making a wry face. She put a finger to her lips. "SSH," she cautioned. "I thought that you would have learned better than that by this time." "Mayn't I even criticize myself?" I asked, laughing. She shook her head. "Were I you, I should criticize only Atorians and the enemy in Sonara." "I don't even do that," I said. "I am what would be called in my work country a rubber stamp." "That is a word I do not know," she said. "Can it be possible that the Voderoans do not speak the same language as we?" "Oh no, we speak the same language," I assured her. "And read it, too?" she inquired. "Why, of course." "I thought so," she mused. I couldn't imagine why she had thought otherwise, or why the matter was of any importance. Before I could ask her, she veered off onto another track. "Do you like Mantar?" she asked. "Very much," I said. "It is nice to have the companionship of one gentleman at least." "Be careful," she cautioned again. That is indirect criticism, but I can assure you it may be just as fatal. You needn't worry about me, however, I caution you only because there are always spies. One never may know who may be listening intently to his conversation in addition to the one to whom it is addressed. Suppose we go for a ride, then we can talk, and you can say anything you wish to. My driver has been with my family all his life. He would never repeat anything he heard. It seemed a little strange that she should be encouraging me to talk openly, in view of the fact that she had previously warned me against it. I'm sure, I said, that all the world might listen to what I have to say. I am most happy here. I am glad of that, she said. I have learned though that it is just as well not to talk too much. In fact, I am surprised that I have not forgotten how to talk. But of course you talk freely with Mantar, she asked. I do not talk at all about anything I am not supposed to talk about, I said. But with Mantar, it is different, she urged. You may trust him fully. Discuss anything you wish with him. Mantar would never betray you. Why? I asked bluntly. Because you are my friend, she replied. I appreciate all that implies, I said, and am very grateful for your friendship. I wish that I might repay the obligation in some way. Perhaps you may have the chance someday, when I know you better. A ganter was brought into the courtyard of the palace, and we mounted to the howdah. This time there were no armed guards, only ourselves and the driver. Where shall we go? Asked Zaka. Anywhere. I should like to see some more of the public buildings. I hoped in this way to discover the location of the Gap Kumrov, where the mysterious Jong was imprisoned. I hadn't dared ask anyone, and I didn't dare ask Zaka, for notwithstanding her assurances that I might speak freely to her, I was not so sure that it would be wise. As far as I knew, she might be a spy herself. The sudden friendship that she had fostered between us gave some color to this suspicion. I didn't want to believe it, for she seemed very sincere in her liking for me, but I could take no chances. I must suspect everyone. In that, I was becoming a true Zani. She gave some directions to the driver, then she settled back. Now, she said, that we are comfortable and alone, let's have a good talk. You see, we really know very little about one another. I have wondered a great deal about you, I said. You are such an important person, and yet you waste your time on a total stranger. I do not feel that I am wasting my time, she said. It is not a waste of time to make new friends. I really have very few, you know. The war and the revolution took most of them, the war took my man. She said, Uljagan, love man. I have lived alone ever since, rather a useless life, I'm afraid. Now tell me about yourself. You know all there is to tell, I assured her. Tell me of your life in Vodaro, she insisted. I should like to know something of the customs and manners of the people of that far country. Oh, I'm sure you wouldn't be interested. We are a simple people. I couldn't very well tell her that she probably knew more about Vodaro than I. But I would be interested, she insisted. Tell me how you got here. I was most uncomfortable. I feel that I am not a very convincing liar. This was really my first essay at really spectacular lying, and I was very much afraid that I might trip myself up. If I lied too much, I should have too many lies to remember. I already had enough to tax my memory as it was. My recollection of even the location of Vodaro was rather hazy. The country was shown on a map I had seen in the library of Tharnus at Kuard. I remembered that fact concerning it, and that was about all, except that it was supposed to run far back into Kabul, the cold country. I had to answer Zaka's question, and my explanation of how I got to Amlot would have to be uncheckable. It was necessary to do a lot of thinking in a split second. One of our merchants had chartered a small ship and had loaded it with furs with which he expected to trade for merchandise in foreign countries. We sailed north for a month without encountering land until we sighted Anlap. Here we were overtaken by a terrific storm which wrecked the ship. I was washed ashore, the sole survivor. A kindly farmer took me in, and from him I learned that I was in the kingdom of Corva, on Anlap. He also told me about the war raging here, and brought me as far as the city gates with a load of farm produce. The rest, I have told you. And what was the name of this kindly farmer? She asked. He should be rewarded. I never learned his name, I said. She looked at me with the oddest expression that made me feel that she knew I was lying, but perhaps it was only my guilty conscience that suggested that fear. Anyway, she didn't say anything more about the matter, for which I was deeply grateful. As we approached one of the main avenues of the city, I saw men standing on their heads shouting Multu Mephis, and others saluting and shouting the same stereotyped mandatory laudative. Our beloved Mephis must be abroad, I said. She shot me a quick glance, but I maintained a perfectly serious demeanor. Yes, she said, and don't forget to stand up and salute and acclaim him. There is to be a review of troops outside the city. A new unit is going to the front. Our beloved Mephis is on his way to review them now. Would you be interested in seeing it? I told her that I would, so after Mephis's cortege passed, we fell in behind and followed it out onto the plain beyond the city. After Mephis had taken his place and the shouting had died out and men had stopped standing on their heads, Zerka directed our driver to move to a point where we could watch the ceremonies advantageously. A large body of troops was massed at some distance to the left, and at a signal from Mephis, transmitted by trumpet to the waiting troops, they broke into column of companies and advanced toward the great man so that they would pass before him at the proper distance. It was so similar to the passing in review of troops in civilized countries on earth that it was rather startling, but when I gave the matter thought, I could not conceive any more practical way of reviewing troops. When the first company was at about 100 yards from Mephis, the step was changed. The entire company, in unison, took 3 steps forward, hopped once on the left foot, took 3 more steps forward, leaped straight up to a height of about 2 feet, and then repeated. They continued in this way until they had passed 100 yards beyond Mephis, and all the time they shouted Multu Mephis, in a sing-song chant. Is that not impressive? Demanded Zerka, at the same time watching me carefully as though to detect my exact reaction. Very, I said. It is an innovation sponsored by our beloved Mephis, explained Zerka. I could easily imagine that might be so, I replied. The prison of death. I had enjoyed my long visit with Zerka. We had eaten again at the same restaurant in which we had met, we had gone to one of the amazing theatres of Amlot, and we had finally gotten home about the 19th hour, which would be about 2 a.m. Earth time. Then Zerka had invited me in for a little supper. But during all that time neither one of us had learned anything of importance about the other, which I think was the uppermost desire in the mind of each of us, nor had I had the gap Kumrov pointed out to me. However, I had had a rather enjoyable day, marred only by my constant and depressing worries concerning Duer. The theatres of Amlot and the plays shown therein under the Zanis are, I believe, of sufficient interest to warrant a brief digression. The audiences in the theatres sit with their backs toward the stage. In front of them on the end wall of the theatre is a huge mirror, so placed that everyone in the house may see it, just as a motion picture screen is placed in our cinemas. The action taking place on the stage behind the audience is reflected from the mirror, and by a system of very ingenious lighting stands out brilliantly. By manipulation of the lights the scenes may be blacked out completely to denote a lapse of time or permit a change of scenery. Of course the reflections of the actors are not life-size, and therefore the result gives an illusion of unreality reminiscent of puppet shows or the old days of silent pictures. I asked Zerka why the audience didn't face the stage and look directly at the actors, and she explained that it was because the profession of acting had formerly been in disrepute, and it had been considered a disgrace to be seen upon a stage. They got around it in this ingenious way, and it was considered extremely poor form to turn around and look directly at the actors, even though the profession was now considered an honorable one. But the thing that amused me most was the play. There are 100 theaters in Amlot, and the same play was being shown in all of them. It was the life of Memphis. Zaka told me that it consisted of 101 episodes, each episode constituting a night's performance, and that it was absolutely obligatory on all citizens to attend the theater at least once in every 10 days. They were given certificates to attest that they had done so. The play had already been running for more than a year. Memphis's publicity agent should have been born in Hollywood. The day following my visit with Zerko, I was given a detachment of the Zani Guard and told to report to the Gap Kumrov. It was just as easy as that. Here I had been trying to locate the place for days, and without success. Now I was being officially detailed to the prison. Just what my duties were to be and whether I was to remain there or not, I did not know. My orders were simply to report to one Torko, governor of the prison of death. My detachment consisted of 11 men, one of whom was a Cordogan, whom I ordered to march the detachment to the prison. I didn't wish them to know that I had no idea where it was. The prison stood on a small island in the bay, not more than 100 yards offshore. I had seen it on several occasions, but had not guessed that it was the notorious Gap Kumrov. At the quay we entered a small launch belonging to the prison and were soon standing beneath its grim walls. The mere fact that we were members of the Zani Guard gave us immediate entrance, and I was presently in the office of Torko. He was a large man, heavy of feature and coarse, with one of the cruelest human faces I have ever seen. Unlike most Emptorians, he was ill-favored. His manner was gruff and surly, and I sensed immediately that he did not like me. Well, our dislike was mutual. "I never saw you before," he growled, after I had reported. "Why didn't they send someone I knew? What do you know about running a prison?" "Nothing," I assured him. "I didn't ask for the assignment. If I can put up with it, I guess you can." He grunted something I couldn't understand, and then said, "Come with me. Now that you're here, you've got to familiarize yourself with the prison and with my system of administration." A second door in his office, opposite the one through which I had entered, opened into a guardroom full of Zani guardsmen, one of whom he ordered to go to the courtyard and fetch my men. Then he crossed to another door, heavily bolted and barred. When this was opened, it revealed a long corridor on either side of which were partitions of heavy iron bars, back of which were huddled several hundred prisoners, many of whom were covered with wounds and sores. "These mistoles," explained Torko, "have been guilty of disrespect to our beloved Memphis or to the glorious heroes of the Zani Guard. Show them no mercy." Next he took me to the end of the corridor, through another door, and up a flight of stairs to the second floor, where there were 2 rows of individual cells, each cell containing from 1 to 3 prisoners, although each would have been cramped quarters for one. "These are traitors," said Torko. "They are awaiting trial. We really haven't enough room here, so every day, when we receive a new batch, we take some of them out and shoot them. Of course, we give them a chance to confess first. If they do, why naturally a trial isn't necessary, and we shoot them. If they don't confess, we shoot them for impeding justice." "Very simple," I commented. "Very," he agreed, "and eminently fair, too. It was my idea. Our beloved Memphis knows how to choose his lieutenants, doesn't he?" He looked very pleased at that, and really smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile, and I hoped he wouldn't do it again. His smile seemed only to make his face appear more cruel and repulsive. "Well," he exclaimed, "I guess I was wrong about you. You talk like a good man and an intelligent one. We shall get along splendidly. Are you very close to our beloved Memphis?" "I'm sorry to say that I'm not," I told him. "I merely serve him." "Well, you must know someone who is," he insisted. I was about to reply, telling him that I was afraid I knew no one who had the ear of Memphis, when he caught sight of the ring hanging on a chain around my neck. It was too small to fit on any of my fingers. I wore it thus. I should say you do know someone close to Memphis, he exclaimed. The Taganja Zerka. Man! But are you lucky? I did not reply, as I had no stomach to discuss Zerka with this beast, but he insisted. She was bright to come over to the Zanis, he said. Most of her kind were killed, and those that did come over are usually under suspicion, but not Taganja Zerka. They say Memphis has the utmost confidence in her and often consults her in matters of policy. It was her idea to have the Zani guard patrol the city, constantly looking for traitors and beating up citizens who couldn't give a good account of themselves. Playing the life of our beloved Memphis constantly in all the theaters was also her idea, as was that of having civilians stand on their heads and cheer whenever our beloved Memphis passed. Even the expression our beloved Memphis was coined by her. Oh, she's a brilliant one. Memphis owes her a lot. All this was most illuminating. I had always felt that Zerka applauded Memphis with her tongue in her cheek. I had even doubted her loyalty to him or to the Zani cause. Now I didn't know what to think, but I certainly congratulated myself upon the fact that I had not confided in her. Somehow, I felt a little sad and depressed, as one does when disillusioned, especially if the disillusionment concerns a friend he has admired. Now, continued Torko, if you should put in a good word for me with the Taganja, it would be sure to reach the ear of our beloved Memphis. How about it, my excellent friend? Wait until I know you better, I said, then I shall know what to report to the Taganja. This was almost blackmail, but I felt no compunction. You'll have nothing but the best to report of me, he assured me. We shall get along splendidly. And now I'll take you down to the courtroom where the trials are conducted and show you the cells where our beloved Memphis keeps his favorite prisoners. He led me down into a dark basement and into a large room with a high bench running across one end. Behind the bench were a number of seats, the whole being raised a couple of feet above the floor level. Around the sides of the room were low benches, which evidently served as seats for spectators. The rest of the room was devoted to an elaborate display of the most fiendish instruments of torture the mind of man might conceive. I shall not dwell upon them. It is enough to say that all were horrible and many of them absolutely unmentionable. All my life I shall be trying to forget them and the hideous things I was forced to see perpetrated there upon both men and women. Torko made a wide, sweeping gesture, proudly. These are my pets, he said. Many of them are my own invention. Believe me, just to look at them usually gets a confession, but we give them a taste of them anyway. After they have confessed? I asked. Why, certainly. Is it not a treasonable thing to cheat the state of the usefulness of these ingenious contrivances that have cost so much in thought and money to produce? Your logic is unimpeachable, I told him. It is evident that you are a perfect Zani. And you are a man of great intelligence, my friend, Vodo. And now, come with me, you shall see some more of this ideal plant. He led me into a dark corridor beyond the torture chamber. Here were small cells, feebly illuminated by a single dim light in the central corridor. A number of men were confined, each in a cell by himself. It was so dark that I could not distinguish the features of any of them, as all remained in the far corners of their cramped quarters, and many sat with their faces hidden in their hands, apparently oblivious of the fact that we were there. One was moaning, and another shrieked and gibbered, his mind gone. That one, said Torko, was a famous physician. He enjoyed the confidence of everyone, including our beloved Memphis. But can you imagine how heinously he betrayed it? No, I admitted, I cannot. Did he attempt to poison Memphis? What he did was almost as bad. He was actually apprehended in the act of alleviating the agony of an Aegean who was dying of an incurable disease. Can you imagine? I am afraid, I said, that my imagination is permanently incapacitated. There are things that transcend the limits of a normal imagination. Today you have shown me such things. He should have been executed, but when he went mad, we felt that he would suffer far more if he lived. We were right. We Zanis are always right. Yes, I agreed, it is the indisputable privilege of all Zanis to be always right. He took me next down a dark corridor to another room at the far side of the building. There was nothing here but an enormous furnace and a foul odor. Here is where we burn the bodies, Torko explained, then he pointed to a trap door in the floor. Be careful not to step on that, he cautioned. It is not very substantial. We dump the ashes down there into the bay. The chute is quite large. If the door gave way with you, you'd land in the bay. I spent a week undergoing a sort of training in inhumanity, and then Torko obtained a leave of absence, and I was left in charge as acting governor of the prison of death. During the time that he was away, I did what I could to alleviate the sufferings of the inmates of that hideous sink of misery and despair. I permitted them to clean up their foul cells and themselves, and I gave them quantities of good food. There were no trials while I was in charge and only one execution, but that was ordered by a higher authority, in fact, by Memphis himself. I received word about the 11th hour one day that Memphis would visit the prison at the 13th hour, 2 p.m. ET. As I had never met the great man and had no idea how to receive him or conduct myself, I was in something of a quandary, as I knew that a single error, however unintentional, would affront him and result in my execution. At last it occurred to me that my cordugan might help me out. He was more than anxious to display his knowledge, and so, as the 13th hour approached, I anticipated the coming event with considerable assurance. With a number of warriors as an escort, I waited at the quay with the prison launch, and when Memphis hove in sight with his retinue, I lined up my men and we saluted and molto Memphist him in orthodox style. He was quite affable as he greeted me with condescending cordiality. I have heard of you, he said. If you are a protégé of Tagangazaka, you must be a good Zani. There is only one good Zani, I said. He thought I meant him, and he was pleased. The cordugan had the remaining guardsmen lined up in the guard room, and as we passed through, everyone saluted and shouted molto Memphis, at the top of his voice. I wondered at the time how Memphis could listen to such forced acclaim without feeling like the ass he was, but I suppose an ass doesn't mind being an ass, or doesn't realize it. The great man asked to be taken into the basement, where his own particular prisoners were incarcerated. He took only me and two of his aides with him, one of the latter being his present favorite, an effeminate-looking man, bejeweled like a woman. When we reached the room where the prisoners' cells were located, Memphis directed me to show him the cell of Cord, the former Jong of Corva. Torko has not told me the names of any of these prisoners, I explained. He said it was your wish that they remain nameless. Memphis nodded. Quite right, he said, but of course the acting governor of the prison should know who they are and keep the knowledge to himself. You wish to speak to me, Memphis? Asked a voice from a nearby cell. That is he, said Memphis. Unlock his cell. I took the master key from my belt and did as Memphis bid me. Come out, commanded he. Cord was still a fine-looking man, though wasted by confinement and starvation. What do you want of me? He demanded. There was no molto Memphis, here, no cringing. Cord was still the Jong, and Memphis shrunk in his presence to the insignificant scum he had been born. I think he felt it, for he commenced to bluster and talk loud. Drag the prisoner to the courtroom, he shouted to me, and turned back to that room himself, followed by his aides. I took Cord gently by the arm. Come, I said. I think he had expected to be jerked or kicked, as he probably had been on former occasions, for he looked at me in something of surprise when I treated him with decent consideration. My heart certainly went out to him, for it must have been galling to a great Jong such as he had been to be ordered about by scum like Memphis, and, too, there must have been the knowledge that he was probably going to be tortured. I expected it, and I didn't know how I was going to be able to stand and watch it without raising a hand in interference. Only my knowledge that it would have done him no good and resulted in my own death and, consequently, the defeat of all my own plans, convinced me that I must hide my indignation and accept whatever was forthcoming. When we entered the courtroom, we saw that Mephis and his aides had already seated themselves at the judge's bench, before which Mephis directed me to bring the prisoner. For a full minute the dictator sat in silence, his shifty eyes roving about the room, never meeting those of Cord and myself but momentarily. At last he spoke. "You have been a powerful Jong, Cord," he said. "You may be Jong once more. I have come here today to offer you your throne again." He waited, but Cord made no reply. He just stood there, erect and majestic, looking Mephis squarely in the face, every inch a king. His attitude naturally irritated the little man, who, though all-powerful, still felt his inferiority to the great man before him. "I tell you, I will give you back your throne, Cord," repeated Mephis, his voice rising. "You have only to sign this," and he held up a paper. "It will end needless bloodshed and restore Corva the peace and prosperity she deserves." "What is written on the paper?" demanded Cord. "It is an order to Muso," replied Mephis, telling him to lay down his arms because you have been restored as Jong and peace has been declared in Corva. "Is that all?" asked Cord. "Practically all," replied Mephis. "There is another paper here that you will sign that will ensure the peace and prosperity of Corva." "What is it?" "It is an order appointing me advisor to the Jong, with full power to act in his place in all emergencies. It also ratifies all laws promulgated by the Zani party since it took control of Corva. In other and more candid words, it betrays my few remaining loyal subjects into the hands of Mephis," said Cord. "I refuse, of course." "Just a moment," snapped Mephis. "There is another condition that may cause you to alter your decision." "And that?" inquired Cord. "If you refuse, you will be considered a traitor to your country, and treated accordingly." "Assassinated." "Executed," corrected Mephis. "I still refuse," said Cord. Mephis rose from his seat. His face was livid with rage. "Then die, you fool," he almost screamed, and, drawing his Amtorian pistol, poured a stream of the deadly arrows into the defenseless man standing before him. Without a sound, Cord, Jong of Corva, sank lifeless to the floor.